Recording in progress.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to call to order this regular meeting of the Planning and Transportation Commission for Wednesday, September 25th. Do I need to say that again? Okay. So Ms. Dow, could you please take the roll?
Chair Chang,
Here.
Vice Chair Rectal,
Here.
Commissioner Aiken,
Here.
Commissioner Liu,
Here, present remotely by myself.
Commissioner Heckman,
Here.
Commissioner
Here.
Suma. Here, we have a quorum.
Great. So our first order of business today is public comment. Ms. Dow, do we have any speaker cards?
Yes, I have one raised hand on Zoom and one speaker card for in person. Believe first is on Zoom, Riley Adler.
Great.
Hello.
Go ahead, Ms. Adler.
Hi. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you all today. My name is Riley Adler, and I'm a senior at Saratoga High School. And last year, I had the opportunity to collaborate with three of my peers, Dylan, who's also here and going to speak today, to create a documentary called The Dark Future for part of our school's media arts program. And we were inspired to make this documentary to highlight the prevalent yet unvoiced issue of light pollution in our community. And as you'll see in just a minute, light pollution, the artificial lighting that disrupts the natural darkness of nature, has a wide range of detrimental effects. For example, our circadian rhythms use light to guide human processes. So excessive light at night can increase internal health problems like anxiety, fatigue. And if we let our environment become darker, these rhythms return to normal cycles, leading to a decrease in mental health issues, especially in teenagers. And a darker environment at night also allows for the return of like normal navigation, predation, sleep cycles, and so much more for animal species around here. So we hope to share with you this documentary to inspire more bird-friendly designs and hopefully some dark sky ordinances. And this way, we can reduce light pollution in our communities and lead to better health for both us and the wildlife around us. So, yeah, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you guys today.
Thank you.
Next is also on Zoom, Dylan Wilson, speaking for a group on behalf of Linda R., Lynn H., Margaret H., and Dashel L.
Hello. Hi, I'm Dylan. I'm also with Riley at Saratoga High School, and I would like to show you guys the video that Riley, I, and the rest of our group created. In North America, nights are becoming 10% lighter each year, hundreds of times brighter than they were 100 years ago, having grim implications for the health of both humans and wildlife. To unpack the consequences of a bright night sky, we interviewed Jane Mio, a freelance environmentalist on light pollution.
Light pollution is the robbery of the dark sky. It has eliminated a beauty that has been always, for all of us, accessible. And it now has become a story of the past.
Light pollution, the excessive artificial lighting produced by humans that disrupts the natural darkness of nature, was initiated by the invention of the light bulb around the Second Industrial Revolution. the cost of artificial lighting rapidly declined and lights became increasingly commonplace. Despite the widely accepted assumption that lights guarantee protection among cities, this misunderstood environmental matter amplifies the degradation of human health and presents significant dangers to natural ecosystems and organisms. In order to understand this complicated topic's impact on human health, we reached out to Stephen Lockley, an associate professor at Harvard in the Division of Sleep Medicine.
We have a clock in the brain which generates 24-hour rhythms, and this clock sends signals out to the brain and the body to control sleep, your hormones, your metabolism, your genetics, controls all the things that you know have a 24-hour pattern. So light pollution would be light at night that is confusing the clock because light's occurring at the wrong time, and that shifts rhythms and gets you out of sync with the real world. One of the first short-term effects of light at night is an impact on sleep, and that has consequences on learning and attention and mood. Over time, people who don't sleep enough have a higher risk of heart disease, of diabetes, and importantly, depression and anxiety. The impact of light at night and device use on sleep is one of the reasons we think that there's an increase in mental health issues among teenagers.
Light pollution harms a wide variety of wildlife by disrupting navigation, predation, sleep cycles, foraging instincts, reproduction, and other habits that species rely on for their survival. To expand on this, we interviewed Andy Kraish, the Vice President of Dark Sky International Santa Cruz chapter, a worldwide organization leading the fight for darker skies.
Birds migrate at night. They use the stars, the movement of the stars over the course of the night to find their way. They'll use the moonlight. Some of them might even be tuned into the Earth's magnetic field. A lot of the stuff we don't even understand, right? 9/11 was this great tragedy where a lot of people lost their lives. And so we want to pay tribute to these people who lost their lives unnecessarily. So what do? We shine these bright, bright lights that mimic the footprints of the Twin Towers in New York City. That's right around the peak of the fall migration season when birds are trying to fly south. This disrupts their ability because this will exhaust these birds and they won't make it to where they go. So it's the ultimate irony to me. We're trying to pay tribute to people who lost their lives by killing another species, literally killing another species.
So far, only 19 U.S. states have put in real legislation regarding light pollution, but individuals have the power to regulate their own impact.
First of all, think about your own light environment. What lights do you have in the bedroom? How often are you using your phone in the bedroom? How dim is the light? How red-orange looking is the light? What exterior lighting do you have on your house? Is that light pointing to the sky and polluting the sky so we can't see the stars? Or is it shining onto plants that then are going to grow at the wrong time of year? And so you can think about, do I really need this light on? Does it really need to be that bright? And am I pointing the light in the right direction if I'm thinking about external lighting?
If enough people support and actively participate in the fight against light pollution, we can work to secure a darker planet and a brighter future.
Thank you. We have the next, I think that speaker's finished, I believe.
Yes.
Okay.
Next is Diane McCoy, also speaking for group Connie C., Laura M., Alan K., and Audrey K.
Go ahead, Ms. McCoy.
Yes, thank you. Good evening. Play a video, please.
The FAME framework helps us assess where our finance teams are today, identify areas for improvement, and chart a path to more effective and intelligent operations. Workday has the expertise, solutions, and technology to get us there.
Time for a story that's truly for the birds, from David Pogue.
In February 2023, a Eurasian eagle owl named Flacco escaped from the Central Park Zoo. For a year, he lived among the skyscrapers and became something of a Manhattan mascot.
You would see him kind of going from window to window looking in at people's apartments.
But then, earlier this year,
well, a sad day for New Yorkers and bird lovers across the country.
He crashed into a building and died.
Oh, Flacco the owl.
As owls go, Flacco was 1 in a million. But as collisions go,
we're talking about hundreds of millions, up to 1 billion birds every year annually, and that's just in the US. So this is a huge, huge problem.
Red-tailed hawk.
Wait, really?
Yeah.
Where's the hawk?
Red tail is coming in this last building.
Cornell ornithologist Andrew Farnsworth has done the math.
That's like 30 birds a second, 30% of the population over 50 years.
Is there a downstream ripple effect from that?
Yeah, they have ecosystem functions and services that they provide, including pest control, pollination, dispersal of seeds. As you lose birds, there definitely are ecosystem structure ramifications.
How are these birds so clueless as to fly into glass?
Birds do not perceive it as solid. They're thinking, oh, there's something that's either I can fly through or a reflection of vegetation or something that they're seeing in it that they're perceiving as not solid. So they fly into it often at full speed, maybe 15, 20, 35 miles an hour.
Every year, billions of birds migrate. They navigate by the stars.
So light pollution, because birds are mostly migrating at night, light is an incredibly powerful stimulus. It attracts birds, it disorients them.
And we're not just talking about skyscrapers. Last fall, at McCormick Place, a low-slung convention center in Chicago, over 1,000 birds died in a single night.
I think it's devastating because there's really not necessarily any reason for it at this point. We know what to do.
We do know what to do. We can start by turning off non-essential lights during migration periods, which also saves energy and money.
We see that birds start to return to normal patterns of behavior as soon as the lights turn off, literally within seconds.
In Texas, a public awareness campaign has produced a dramatic effect. Look at these before and after shots of Dallas, Houston, and Fort Worth. Turning off the lights can cut down bird strikes by 60%. As for the rest, it's all about making the invisible visible.
Putting special kinds of decals on the outsides of your windows, spaced 1 or 2 inches apart, just as an example.
Isn't that interrupting our enjoyment of the big vista?
Eventually, as you get used to those things, they disappear into the background.
But in newer buildings, like this apartment building going up in Queens, you don't need to sacrifice any view at all.
This is bird safe glass right here, and I don't see a thing.
No, but on the outside,
it's
different. Oh, I see patterns.
That's right. The UV pattern is here, and you can see it when you walk pretty close, but when you step back, you don't see it at all. Looks great.
That's ingenious. The building was designed by FX Collaborative Architects, for whom Dan Piselli is the sustainability director. In 2014, his firm also fixed the biggest bird killer in New York City, the Javits Convention Center, 6 blocks of pure glass.
We used a material called frit on the glass, which is just a bunch of dots that are kind of baked on. And the collisions there were reduced by more than 90%.
In 2019, New York City passed an ordinance requiring all new buildings to be built with bird-friendly glass. San Francisco, Toronto, and Washington, D.C. have all passed similar legislation. And McCormick Place in Chicago? They've now installed those safety dot stickers. Is it conceivably possible that 50 years from now, Flacco free in New York City might still be flying around?
I like to think so. I think that we're on the right track in terms of the laws and that people are starting to understand. I hope so.
Thank you.
And then last speaker in person is from Shani Kleinhaus.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed those little films. It's hard to understand these issues, but when you can see some of them, that helps. So Julianne prepared a little presentation, and she's in China and she wasn't able to connect. So I'm going to try and make her presentation. So bear with me a little bit here. So thank you. First slide. Palo Alto is blessed with a large diversity of birds in all our city, both in the urban areas and in the baylands and the hills. And I'm not sure, I guess you can see that, yeah. So next slide, I don't have what it says. So we thought we'll show you one of those birds. This bird is the white crowned sparrow. It comes here in winter and spends the winters in Palo Alto. It breeds in Alaska, and it comes in, and if you can play the song, at the bottom, there's a little video. Yeah, that little video where, so this is its song, and when you hear that, you know winter is coming. I don't know if it's playing the music. No? Oh, well, we'll go to the next one. Next slide. So the white-crowned sparrow is quite a common bird, and it's very easy to see them in winter. They're in the baylands, they are in our area, in the flatlands. The hills have a somewhat different species with similar kind of habits. It's called the yellow crown, or golden crown sparrow. Because they're on the ground, they're very susceptible to cats, and they also collide with windows. We'll go to the next one. I can't read what it says, so there's other information that Julianne prepared that you can see. This video, I hope you can see it because it shows the migration of the species. No, not yet. Go back, please, and see if you can play that video. It's a video. The purple is where the birds are in winter. And this video should show how the birds migrate north and come back, and it's pretty striking. This is a very common species in a lot of areas in the United States. Can you see if you can make it move? We've done it before, so it should work, no? Oh, can you? I guess we needed the other version. So the next one was really important to see, and maybe I'll come back and show this in video, because what this one shows, this is the United States, and this is an app, or you can use it on your phones or on your computers. It's called Birdcast. And when you see it, it shows how when the sun goes down, the birds start migrating. And and they migrate all night, and it gives you an idea of how many throughout the United States. It's really pretty striking. I guess, I don't know if there's any more slides there. This just shows the threats to the white-crowned sparrow. Because of climate change, its range is expected to shrink substantially and move north. Cats, like I said before, and I'm not sure what else it has there, and I wish I could show you the videos because they're pretty good. So maybe later you can get the, not the PDF, the other version, and all these videos would work for you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kleinhaus. You can also send things you can email them to the commission. Yeah. Do we have any other speakers, Ms. Dow?
No, that's all our speakers.
Okay. So our next agenda item is city official reports. Ms. Armour?
Good evening. We've got just a couple slides here on the upcoming meetings for the Planning and Transportation Commission. We've got a stream corridor ordinance review planned for October 9th. And we do have scheduled an opportunity to look at draft ordinances for dark sky lighting and bird-friendly design for October 30th. So that is an upcoming discussion. In addition, in November and December, we have a number of different items coming forward. We expect to bring to you the annual comprehensive plan reporting, the housing element implementation programs status, and parking programs update and discussion. As you'll see, there have been some things shifting around since our report at the last meeting. And so then on the next slide, we've got just a couple of upcoming items going to council, the work plan for Planning and Transportation Commission, as well as for ARB and HRB, will be going to City Council on October 21st. We are asking the chairs for each of those committees to attend, to talk to the work plan, and we'll be reaching out with more details about the PowerPoint for that presentation. And that, I believe, is the end of our items for this report. Please note that we did put together a list of meeting dates for 2025, and that was included in your packet. Do please let us know as soon as you have information about any expected absences so that we can make sure to plan for those, or work if you're joining us remote, we need to know that as soon as you have that information. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions from commissioners? Oh, Commissioner Heckman.
Thank you. So October 30th, the dark sky ordinance draft is scheduled to come back before us. And I just wanted to remind staff that one of the things we're hoping will be a part of the staff presentation is some member of the police department to talk to us about their lighting concerns, because those were expressed sort of secondhand in prior staff reports, and we'd like to hear directly from them.
Thank you. We do have made note of that request, and we have reached out to them to get additional information.
I actually add maybe a little bit more. We've already met with them, and I don't believe their presence will be necessary when we meet.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, as long as we get, so as long as you've done the work and can report to us on whether they continue to have concerns or maybe they've changed their minds on some of these lumen issues. I just want to see if they're on board. Also, are we getting a report from anybody from transportation tonight?
So I think Mr. Rios is online, right?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
My turn? Okay. This is Rafael Rios, Senior Engineer with the Office of Transportation. Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. A couple of updates from our department. First one's for the El Camino bike lane and repaving project. You're probably experiencing it, but it's right in the middle of paving. They actually expect to finish the paving portion by next week. They will also Caltrans will also be paving parts of Los Altos and Mountain View. So striping is not going to be temporary striping until they're expecting November, when they'll come back and restripe all three cities. And formal completion of the project right now is targeted for spring of 2025. That's because they have to do some electrical stuff with the traffic signals for the detectors and such. I know during the last meeting we talked about fall of 2025 as an end date, and that's the contract completion date for the contractors. Got clarification on that. So they're hoping not to have to go all the way to fall and targeting spring for completion. Next project, our department recently kicked off the Southern Palo Alto Bike Ped Railroad Crossing Alternatives Analysis. It's really early in stages. It got kicked off. The project's going to start with background and data collection, as well as development of an outreach plan. We don't have dates yet, but our staff anticipates bringing this project or this item to this Planning and Transportation Commission probably in early 2025. And kind of in parallel, this project efforts will be coordinated with the Bicycle and Pedestrian Transportation Plan update. And then my last update I have is just that Bike Palo Alto is Sunday, October 6th. I'm be at Fair Meadow Elementary School at 1 o'clock, 1 to 3 p.m. And that's all I have. Any questions?
Go ahead, Commissioner Heckman.
Thank you. Mr. Rios, can you update us on your department's discussions with the police department on including KSIs in our monthly traffic incident reports?
Yes, so I did myself request that of PD. There is pushback right now. The data that we share with you is the same data that we share with the Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. They will first response back. I've been declined by our PD, so I've also shared the request with the project managers for the Safe Streets for All project that are leading the effort and understand the need for it. So I'm gonna kind of recruiting their help in changing our PD's mind to get this. I do want to note though that the Safe Streets for All report, it does use historic data, and I believe that data that includes KSI that's being used as part of that analysis, if it hasn't already, will be made available to the commission.
So, Mr. Rios, I understand that the police aren't wanting to give us this information, and I understand that our Safe Streets for All project uses historical data, but it's really disconcerting to me, given the goal is to reduce the KSIs to 0, that we are not seemingly able to track it. So what can we do to help you get this information, because we want the information?
Understood, and I'm in agreement with you completely. Let me talk to Sylvia, who's our transportation planning manager, and see what kind of efforts we can combine to change their minds. So,
would it help if the commission wrote a letter to PAPD?
I mean, it wouldn't hurt. But let me, well, not sure how to answer that, but I think it would, any kind of support for it would be helpful. And I'll mention this also to our planners.
Okay, thank you.
Chair.
Yeah.
So I'm not very familiar with the material that you're asking for, and I understand it sounds like there's some interdepartmental need for coordination. So let me take that on as a responsibility to follow up with the chief transportation official and the police chief to see if we can't get you the information you're looking for.
That would be great. So just the context for this is that it's the monthly report on collisions in Palo Alto, and we've been asking for, it took us many months to get the report, but then since we received the report, we've wanted the information on for each of the collisions, if it was a collision that resulted in a serious injury or a death. And it seems really relevant because of the project. And we've asked repeatedly for that too, but I understand that they are having data difficulties.
Yeah, and if the data is not available, that's one thing, but if it's available, then we'll look at ways to being able to share that with the
community. Great, thank you.
And ultimately it must, ultimately it must be available because this Safe Streets program, the measure of success is a reduction in fatalities and significant injuries. So the only way to determine its success is to have data to see those numbers go down. So it may be a formatting issue, and I appreciate the director, taking this on. Maybe it's as simple as it may just need to come to us in a different form, and we can work with that. But it has to come to us in some form, and it shouldn't be the data from 2 years ago. I think that's what we're talking about.
And if it's not available, then that's something that's going to obviously have to be solved for the success of the program. So either way, thank you.
I had one other minor thing. Today in public comments, one of the items was in the emailed public comments was a letter from someone regarding the Challenger School queuing out on, he said Arrastradero, but I was wondering if that section is it Charleston? Yeah, it's Charleston, where the cars necessarily sit in the bike lane because the width of the street is not sufficient for them to sit outside the bike line without blocking that line of traffic. So I just wanted to make sure that the transportation department was aware of that, and they're going to look into it, and we might hear about it in a future meeting.
I can confirm we did receive that concern, the submission of that concern, and kind of preliminarily, I've asked the staff that brought it up to me, and we have to research a little bit. We're gonna having them look into the use permit and kind of any requirements, because typically there's requirements to try to keep the queuing on site and not let it spill onto the streets. And then if there's any action that can be included with that. But yeah, I'm don't have too much other information on that right now, but we did receive it. I can confirm we did receive it, and we'll be looking into it. So.
Thank you, Mr. Rios. I actually have a follow-on about that one. There's also additional traffic violations. You can see that there are cars in the intersection. And so I imagine it is causing, aside from being illegal, it's also causing a lot of problems for the traffic there. So that communication from the member of the public, or the communication between the member of the public and I believe it was a school official, was saying that they welcome the assistance of PAPD in addressing some of the traffic violations that are occurring. So if in your liaising with the police department, you could also pass that on, that might be helpful. It does look very unsafe. And then finally, Mr. Rios, I had an unrelated question about El Camino Real. So I wanted some clarification. You were saying that they're almost done with the paving. So does that mean that the current traffic disruptions that we're experiencing as a result of the paving will temporarily cease until they come back for the restriping?
Yes, I would anticipate that. I can't speak directly or 100% confidence, but I would anticipate all the equipment. I mean, the roads will be smooth with temporary, thinner lines temporarily until they can come back and stripe the permanent thicker lines. But yeah, my understanding is the next month or so they'll be working in Mountain View and Los Altos, and then coming to stripe all three cities in November.
Okay, thank you. So it sounds like by the end of the month, they're probably going to be finished in Palo Alto, at least with the repaving. Is that correct?
I was told by the end of next week. Oh, I guess that is the end of the month. So, yeah. Sorry.
Great. I think we're all excited for that. Thank you so much. Okay. So our next agenda.
I'm sorry, Chair.
Sorry.
Just one point of clarification. There was an email sent this morning with the collision data for August. And I just wanted to make sure, is it something above and beyond that you are looking for?
Yeah, are you happy to be looking at that on your screen?
Yeah, I have
If you look at the last column, it lists injuries, but that's a generic term, so that could be any level of injury. And so what we're looking for is a breakout from that number of any fatality, whether any of those injuries were either fatalities or significant injuries.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for that clarification.
Thank you. Okay, so our next agenda item is our main agenda item of the evening. This is a study session to review potential amendments to the regulations for the Affordable Housing Incentive Program, AHIP, and the Housing Incentive Program, or HIP, in Title 18. Could we have the staff report, please?
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. We have Jean Eisberg from Lexington Planning, who's going to give the presentation. Ms. Dow, if we can have the slide deck put up on the screen.
So while that's coming up, John, unless you have anything else you want to say, Mr. Late, I can get started.
Yeah, thank you.
So again, I'm Jean Eisberg with Lexington Planning. I'm joined by Jane Lynn, architect and urban designer from Urban Field, and Tim Bretz, who's a principal with Kaiser Marston Associates. So we're going to tag team this presentation. So our agenda and meeting purpose. So I'm going to go over the housing element, both of the local incentive programs, the housing incentive program and the affordable housing incentive program, and potential and planned changes that are identified in the housing element. We'll also talk about the context of state density bonus law, which plays into the options that developers have when they're pursuing housing projects. We'll review the draft findings of both the physical and financial feasibility analyses that were called for in the housing element, and these suggest some potential changes specifically to the HIP, the Housing Incentive Program. And then we'll have a discussion and look forward to your feedback. Next slide, please. So there's really three programs that developers have available to them in Palo Alto to achieve additional density. So projects have a base set of zoning standards that produce a certain amount of housing yield, and then they have this option to pursue additional density bonuses. So first we have the Housing Incentive Program. That allows for modifications to development standards for market rate projects. So those projects only need to meet the city's inclusionary requirements. It's only eligible for projects in commercial districts, and it requires that projects go through architectural review with the ARB. Next, we have the Affordable Housing Incentive Program, or the AHIP. Again, allows a certain number specific development standards that can be modified for really middle income projects. It says affordable, but this is up to 120% of AMI. And again, only in commercial districts within a half mile of major transit at Caltrain. And again, in exchange for processing through architectural review. And then third, we have state density bonus law, which you may be familiar with, which allows a broader set of modifications to development standards in exchange for on-site affordable housing. So no fee payments in lieu or senior housing. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit about how these compare. So just getting a little bit deeper, the AHIP was adopted about 6 years ago and originally required a legislative map amendment. So that meant that a project that wanted to invoke the AHIP had to go in front of the ARB, a recommendation by the PTC, and then adoption by City Council because that was a legislative action. This was modified just a couple years ago to streamline the review process, and again, just require architectural review by the ARB. Now, the program's only been used once in the last 6 years, so we can infer from that maybe it hasn't been that successful, or at least hasn't been broadly applied. Next slide, please. So the housing element calls for very specific changes to the AHIP. So my hope is that this is not, we won't require a lot of discussion around this, but I just want to explain what those changes are. So the program 3.3 in the housing element calls for modifying FAR to allow a 2.4 FAR, allows for up to a 60-foot height limit from 50 feet, but only for projects that have a deeper level of affordability. So that's at 60% of AMI rather than the 120%. So it will create two classes of building height depending on the affordability of a project. And then third, to reduce parking ratios consistent with state law. In terms of applicability, the program is proposed to modify the applicability not just for commercial districts and not just within a half a mile in transit, but to apply to all housing opportunity sites. So a developer could invoke this if they meet the affordable threshold. Next slide, please. So shifting gears to the Housing Incentive Program. This was approved about 5 years ago as part of a package of zoning standards for the previous housing element to increase housing production. This was an alternative to state density bonus law. So a developer would have to choose, can't use both. The idea behind the HIP was to provide a way to maintain the city's base zoning density and require architectural review. So the ARB reviews the project. There's not an unlimited number of waivers that you see in state density bonus law. And in that way, it offers more predictable design control. There is a discrete list of standards that can be modified under the HIP. No other eligibility requirements. Again, this applies to market rate projects that just need to meet the city's inclusionary requirements. But again, it has not been very well utilized. It's been used by a couple projects twice in the last 5 years. And the housing element, as we'll see on the next slide, looks at some modifications. Next slide, please. So The first 3 points, again, the housing element provides very clear direction from program 3.4. First, to streamline the process. Things have changed since adoption of the HIP. Now we've got a number of streamlining programs allowed by state law, the idea, and by the city with a new streamlined process that's allowed by the code. So a HIP project with this new program implementation that complies with objective standards could be administratively reviewed through one meeting with the ARB. Second, the program calls to modify the retail requirements, waiving the retail preservation requirement for opportunity sites development and reducing the replacement requirement on other sites, except in some specific locations. Third, to expand the applicability. Again, right now the HIP is only applicable in the commercial districts. This program implementation would add both the RM zones and the ROLM GM focus area on the eastern side of the city. Now, the fourth item is the one I expect we'll spend a little more time today, and this is where we needed to do more analysis and why we have Jane and Tim here to help us. So we're looking at modifying zoning standards. That's what the housing element program says, to look at a few different standards: potential building height, FAR, parking, and other development standards to enable greater housing production. And so we'll talk about what we found from that physical and financial analysis. Next slide, please. So this is just showing in gray or black, showing where the existing housing incentive program applies, and then in sort of this pink mauvey color, where it would apply in the future, including the RM and the GM ROLM zones, and then to all housing inventory sites. Next slide, please. And then again, we're comparing this to state density bonus law because, of course, developers have a choice and they're going to choose what makes more sense for their project. State density bonus law, just to recap, is bonus density in exchange for on-site affordable housing or senior housing. It allows for an unlimited number of waivers of standards that would physically preclude the development of the housing units. And there's been a number of changes in this law in recent years since the adoption of the city's HIP programs, most notably allowing unlimited density bonus for 100% affordable projects and up to 100% density bonus for a mixed income project. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at potential changes, we can think of them in the context of what a developer might choose. And the local HIP needs to be as good or better than the incentives under state law in order for anyone to use it. Right now, currently, there's a couple incentives, and the green boxes are showing relative benefits or advantages. And so the HIP actually can provide higher densities than what can be achieved under state law. And that's because the city's base zoning standards are relatively low in many districts, the FARs, the densities. And the HIP can allow FAR and density higher than what state law can allow. The other key advantage of the HIP is that all a project needs to do is meet the city's inclusionary housing ordinance. And that is a fee in lieu for rental projects, on-site housing for sale projects. Most rental housing developers will choose to pay the fee in lieu. They pay the fee up front, they get it off their books for the long term. And so that's really one of the key advantages of the HIP. On the flip side, in state law, there's a lot more flexibility. There's an unlimited number of waivers. So if certain standards don't work for a project, the developer requests that waiver and the city needs to grant it. On the city side, one of the key reasons, again, that the HIP was adopted was to require architectural review and to add that predictability in terms of what community members, the city could expect in terms of the design of a project. Next slide, please. So how do we determine what that sort of right sweet spot of development standards are? And this is where the analysis comes into play. Next slide, please. And so what we did is first we tested the city's existing zoning standards to understand what is the envelope that's produced by the existing standards, how many units can you get on a prototypical site, and then next looked at whether that prototypical model would actually be financially feasible. Would somebody build it? Then we went ahead and tweaked those standards, tested the modified standards to see if we could achieve financial feasibility. And now what we're talking to you about tonight is considering some modifications to, again, improve both that physical and financial feasibility. Next slide, please. So we mostly took sites from the housing element, opportunity sites. We tried to choose a selection of sites that were different in terms of being interior lots, corner lots, lots with alleys. I will say these sites are on the smaller side. We have a number of 5,000, 10,000 square foot lots. So you could think of this as a more conservative analysis. In general, larger sites are going to perform better in terms of both physical feasibility, because you have more room to work with, especially at the ground floor, and then financial feasibility. You get more units on a site, you have more economies of scale. So we'll move on to the next slide, and I'm going to shift gears and hand this off to Jean. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeannie. Hi, everyone. My name is Jane Lynn. I'm an architect and urban designer with Urban Field Studio. I worked closely with Jeannie and with Tim, who's an economist, to work on these feasibility studies. And in your packet, there is a report on all of the different studies, but we thought we'd just use this one for a quick review of what is in there. But as Jeannie just explained the process, the first thing we did was look at the zoning standards that you have already for RM30 and a number of other sites as well, and to just define what is the developable box. Generally, there is a height limit, there are other kinds of setbacks, and we took the sites that we got and looked at exactly what fits inside of that site. And in many cases, the resulting yield for sites was noted, and the way that you had to fit within it sometimes was a little less than logical, but it does give us a sense of what we can do to maximize what is going on the site in terms of housing. So just to keep going, next slide, please. What we found when we did the existing zoning standards and tested them, and this is really just from an architect's point of view, a physical feasibility study, so it's just what fits. We found that really you couldn't go any higher density than a townhome. Even on the larger sites, it was really hard to achieve townhomes. Anything larger than a townhome. And generally, if you're trying to get retail or mixed use or stack flats, any kind of apartments, that these existing zoning standards were limiting for that. And so that's something to consider as we are trying to figure out which standards are affecting that physical feasibility. In many cases, we looked at the parking, building height, FAR, densities, and retail requirements to all together as a combination of what's affecting the physical feasibility. On the next slide, please. Oh, and this is where after we tested to see how much we could yield, we had Tim come in and give it the economist's approach.
Thanks, Jane. Again, I'm Tim Bretz with Kaiser Marston Associates. And so, yes, the first step was to create development scopes that could be physically achieved on each of the sites. And so the next step after that was to test the financial feasibility of those scopes of development. And so to do that, we performed pro forma analyses for each of the development prototypes. And the pro forma analyses consist of various inputs, primarily including construction costs, which includes land costs, direct costs, indirect costs, and financing costs, and then estimated sales prices or market rents for each of the prototypes, and then typical developer profit margins. And so for the pro forma analysis, we solved for what we're calling either a net financial surplus or a net financial cost. And so if the prototype's value was greater than the construction costs and the developer profit margin, then we deemed that to have a net financial surplus, and we deemed it likely to be developed. Conversely, if the prototype's value was less than the construction costs plus the developer profit margin, that resulted in a net financial cost. And for those prototypes, we deemed them to be unlikely to be developed. Next slide, please. And so this table summarizes the findings of the prototypes that we developed for the existing zoning standards. Each of the prototypes for the pro forma analyses resulted in a net financial cost. And so we deemed each of those prototypes to be unlikely to be developed under existing zoning standards. Next slide.
All right, so once we realized that it was that only townhouses could fit, and that even then it wasn't that feasible, we started to consider which zoning changes were needed to enhance feasibility. And when we're looking at this, we're trying to accommodate higher density, stacked flats and mixed use development on these sites, and just trying to see what it takes to make that happen. We know that this would improve the financial feasibility, and whenever we could, we tried to retain Palo Alto design values that are part of the standards. So what we typically did was look at the key development standards to change, and that included increasing or eliminating the residential density, increasing the floor area ratio, FAR, and reducing parking requirements. These are all really important to increasing the amount of housing you can get on each site. There were a lot of other additional regulations to refine when we were looking at these sites, and they really had to do with what was already in place in terms of the neighborhood context. And this had to do with increasing building height, making sure that, you know, where it is in the city, some of these changes are actually quite minor or slight. And then others are looking at the daylight plane. We'll look at that in just a moment, revising that slightly, but maintaining the ethos of it, reducing setbacks also slightly, and then increasing site coverage, and then revising the use requirements for retail. On the next slide, you'll see that as far as our example is concerned, you can see compared next to each other what the yield is for the existing zoning and what the yield is for the modified zoning. In this case, it really helps allow a little bit more density. It goes from 4 to 7 units, and it makes a little bit more logical sense in the way it's constructed. Here, what you see is the daylight plane in particular. It is maintained in general. However, it is where it starts is raised to 16 feet, and this is actually when it starts at 10 feet, it's stricter than a lot of other heights right there at the setback. So it's really a small change of 6 feet for where it starts, but it does decrease the height limit as in the way that it does with the 45-degree angle. That stays the same. So what you see here is how all of these different standards work together to make it possible to have a few more units on site. This is not a significantly big change going from 35 feet to 40 feet. It still can maintain the character of residential neighborhood. And so this is just one of the examples here, but there are other examples where we really look at how you can go from townhomes to apartments in that typology. And what you can see is there are quite a few tables in that report that show what the big differences are. And when we were testing, we really were seeing that the biggest thing that limits density is parking. And so there's some exploration of how that could be decreased. And it actually is not always the ratio that decreases, but also the way that it's parked, in whether it could be parked in a tandem configuration where it's part of podium parking, and there's other ways that it could also be parked. And we also considered, mechanical stackers for some of the site tests as well. Also increasing the site coverage, and what is currently in the existing zoning is less than half of the site being covered, and considering something that is a little bit more than half, but still making sure that's not 100% site coverage. It's really still meeting what the setbacks, more than what the setbacks set for site coverage, and just to also adjust the daylight plane, how we explained before, really keeping it, but adjusting it upwards for where it starts. There are clearly more different standards and how they work, but I just wanted to stress that the way that they work, they need to be considered all together, because without each of these moves, it is really difficult to achieve any kind of higher density than what is existing. And now I think I pass this back to Tim.
Yeah, and so again, we prepared pro forma analyses for the conceptual scopes of development that Jane came up with for the proposed HIP zoning standards. And the results of these pro forma analyses were they all resulted in net financial surpluses. And so we deemed all of these prototypes to be likely to be developed. Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you. So a number of the potential HIP changes have actually already gone into effect. So when we talk about the current zoning standards that Jane was testing, we were testing the standards that were in place prior to the updates in January that were adopted as part of the housing element and to meet the RENA. And so some of that has already happened. What we're talking about is this additional increment of standards needed to get to that financial feasibility. And as Jane explained on the right-hand side, this is really a package of standards that work together. Next slide, please. So again, the idea here is to push the HIP towards being a really viable option that someone could use instead of state density bonus law, in order, again, to retain the city's design values. So we don't have this unlimited number of waivers. Instead, we have this discrete list of development standards that can be modified under the HIP. And the advantages still here are that you can get more density under the HIP, under what we're suggesting here. You have the in lieu fee, and then the parking, streamlined review process are the same. Next slide, please. So again, if we think about sort of summarizing, why is this still relevant? Why do we still need to do this, even with the changes that were made in January? First, the changes made in January only applied to housing element opportunity sites. Essentially, there's now two tracks of standards that apply in Palo Alto, depending on whether or not a site is a housing opportunity site. So there's two different sets of standards that apply to even the same zoning district. So we want to create an incentive program that's a viable option for those non-housing element opportunity sites. Second, the HIP, as explained in the housing element, supports the city's AFFH goals. That's the affirmatively furthering fair housing goals to distribute housing units and affordable housing units throughout the city. If we were to not do the HIP, an alternative could be a rezoning or upzoning on a citywide level. Third, that this is reflecting community support for higher density housing, and that we're seeing in the market, it looks more like 4, 5, even 6 stories that we're seeing both in Palo Alto and nearby, and that the city has recently established for portions of El Camino Real and the focus area, the RLM GM focus area. And then lastly, again, that this provides an opportunity for that more predictable design control through either architectural review or even the streamlined review consistent with objective standards, especially in light of changes in state law. We have SB 330 that now caps the number of meetings, SB 35, which is a ministerial approval. And so this provides that streamlining which is comparable to state law. Next slide, please. So how would this actually work? Again, I explained we have these sort of two tracks now of standards. There's different base zoning standards that apply depending on whether a site's a housing opportunity site or not. The thinking here is that the HIP would be an increment. So as Jane explained, maybe it's a 1.0 FAR increase that's needed that would be added either to the base zoning, whether it's an opportunity site or not. So that increment is the same. The total amount you could achieve is different depending on whether you're a housing opportunity site or not. Next slide, please. So wrapping up, we have our study session tonight. We're going to meet with the ARB next week to get their feedback on the ideas for potential changes to the HIP. And then we expect to come back to the commission before the end of the year and then to council after the new year. Next slide, please. So these last three slides, in terms of the PTC's discussion, first looking for confirmation of those AHIP modifications. Again, these were well specified in the housing element, modifications to the zoning standards and expanding the applicability. Next slide, please. Then confirming the HIP modifications. So on this slide, we're showing the specific changes to the HIP that were outlined in the housing element in terms of streamlining the process, modifying the retail preservation requirements, and expanding applicability. Next slide, please. And the last, and again, this is probably where we spend more of our time, is considering this package of potential modifications. And as Jane explained, this is really a package. So all of these standards work together to create a building envelope that allows a project to be built. Now, if there are deal breakers on this list, things that you have concerns about, we can push and pull on these standards, but they are interrelated. And so, especially when we think about the ground floor, it's a very competitive space. And so reducing parking requirements frees up room for retail or other uses. So things like that. So we are looking for your feedback here about standards you may have concerns about. So this is, I think that's the last slide. That wraps up our presentation. I just want to encourage you, we do have Jane and Tim here tonight. They will likely not be here when we have our ordinance. So I want to encourage you to ask them any questions you have about all the pro formas and all the models. Thank you, and we're happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Let's start with commissioner questions, clarifying questions, please only, and then we'll take public comment if there is any. So light them up if you got questions. Okay, first Commissioner Reckdahl, then Commissioner Aiken.
Yeah, can you go to slide 10?
This map is so much more helpful. This is so much better.
Okay, can you refresh my memory? The difference between waivers and concessions, that always confuses me.
So waivers are exceptions to physical standards that would preclude the development of the housing units. Concessions are for standards or regulations that add actual costs to a project. So for example, if a city were to have a requirement around a specific material that was required, that could be requested as a concession. Whereas waivers we typically think of as development standards like setbacks, upper story step backs, things like that.
Okay, so daylight plane would be
a waiver.
A waiver, unlimited waivers. Okay, next question is, if you look at slide 13. Yeah, these sites are all pretty small, which was a good test case. How do they compare to the population as a whole? We have on packet page 70, and we have the output, the printout here. We have all the different HIP sites. How do these, are these a good cross section? Are these smaller than the average lot, or how does this compare?
It is a pretty good cross-section. I will tell you, we did look originally at some larger sites. A lot of the larger sites that were opportunity sites were already either had projects on them proposed, because, you know, typically the larger sites that are available will go first. We wanted to test sites that didn't have development projects because we tended to know that the development projects were penciling. So I would say they are representative, but yes, this is a somewhat conservative estimate because conservative evaluation of financial feasibility, since we did test smaller standards sites.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Aiken?
Hi, first, thank you for the depth and quality of this work. It's really excellent. And also, the presentation answered a number of the clarifying questions that I would otherwise have had. But I do want to pursue a couple more. One question I would have asked was, are you looking for support on all the changes as a package, or are you open to discussion of modifications? And what I'm hearing is you really want to treat this as a package, but with some reluctance, there can be open discussion on some of the items. So is that an accurate assessment?
The package of standards gets to the maximum density. Now, we've put that out there as maybe our objective in figuring out where is that threshold, where is that line of feasibility. I don't want to suggest I'm coming to you and we already have suggested an answer and you need to accept it. That I don't mean to intend that at all. We are looking for your feedback on areas that you have concerns about that you don't think work. We were trying to be very sensitive about adjacencies. We know that there's often concerns about adjacencies to lower density districts. My caveat is only that if we are not going to, if we don't want to see any additional building height, then we want to be more generous about lot coverage. You know, that we can push and pull in some of these places, but the development envelope, we're trying to get to the same amount of yield.
Right. I will have more to ask you about when we get to the commissioner comments then. We had an interesting project not long ago on Encino Way where we were trying to build out to essentially to the lot lines, and it caused some interesting problems with fire safety, which resulted in design changes. So I'm curious as to whether any of the prototypes that were developed as part of this effort were vetted for fire safety, and whether that might have some effect on whether they're viable or not.
Jane, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Yes, well, what you have in terms of setbacks and building heights are very commonly found in other cities as well. And I think that they are, they follow fire safety rules. There are other ways of dealing with adjacent buildings. And of course, then those codes kick in, but basically there's nothing here that is unusual compared to other cities. And you see very much similar kinds of zoning or development standards applied.
So the cases that particularly caught my eye were the zero setback cases for side and rear. So that's not very common around here, and I don't know what provisions might have been made to make that possible, but it certainly was an issue with the design we saw recently, and that's why I brought it up. I think that's enough for clarifying questions for me. Thank you.
Commissioner Liu?
Thank you. I'm really excited to discuss this. I had just a few kind of technical clarifying questions. The first one is about the AHIP. So I understand the benefit for moderate income housing, but if someone wanted to develop more affordable housing, why would, can you explain why the AHIP at 60% is appealing compared to using the state density bonus plus SB 35?
I think it is very lean. I think you're raising a good point. The state density bonus law is known, it's generally easier. I think that we've only seen use of the AHIP at that higher threshold. I'm not sure we'll see it at this lower threshold with the 60-foot height limit. That said, again, it does offer higher densities. So No, excuse me, it doesn't, because state density bonus law, you can be unlimited with a 100% project. So I think it's thin. To be honest, we're trying everything. I think that was part of the housing element approach. It called for some specific changes to the AHIP, and I think part of it's like, let's give it a try and see if it works. But I hear you. I think that AHIP is lean compared to state density bonus law.
Yeah, and just for context for other people also, the state density bonus law, of course, gives more flexibility as long as the weighted average affordability is, I think, 80%. And SB 35 also gives more streamlining, I think. So the combination of those two would be strictly better than the AHIP at lower income levels, like 60%. Also, I just wanted to ask, what's the vision for how ARB study sessions will work if there's only one study session? Will they make recommendations that the planning director will then take? Or will they just kind of provide optional advice? Or will they comment on objective standards? Like what do we envision that looking like?
So the way that expedited, I think it's called expedited review, streamlined review is written into the code right now. One study session with the ARB, it's based on objective standards. And so essentially the staff report is maybe written a little bit differently, that these are the objective standards, and the review by the ARB is isolated to the objective standards and although they make other comments, it's just about compliance with objective standards.
Yeah, I'll just jump in to say we've done this several times already. Basically the ARB will provide sort of voluntary guidance to the developer. Like, here are some changes we think would improve your project. And it's, left to the developer to accept those or not.
Okay. So even when the comments are related to objective standards, those are still voluntary and not necessarily, or can you just comment more on that?
Yeah, sorry. No, if there's an issue with meeting an objective standard, or if there was some, an error that was made in how it was applied, we would treat, that would be a recommendation to the director that the director would take into consideration. But for the most part, the ARB review is focused on, other issues, because there's not much to say about an objective standard, right? It's generally you've met it or not. And so the ARB is going to be providing more subjective guidance, but it's not binding.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I know we've done this a few times, but it's helpful to clarify. Kind of related to Commissioner Aiken's question, have we gotten any feedback from for-profit or nonprofit developers about HIP updates or AHIP updates?
So we've talked to developers as we've been preparing both the housing element and the El Camino focus area standards and the ROLM GM focus area standards. So part of the preparation of these physical models, you may recall these physical models that Jane showed are also actually in the housing element. This is what helped identify potential governmental constraints in that chapter. And so we did review these standards with a few different developers to get their feedback.
Okay. Thank you. And maybe one last question, kind of on the edge of a clarification and more substantive question. What have we considered any other forms of streamlining, like deadlines for review or deadlines to get in front of the ARB or anything else kind of similar to other streamlining measures in the state and in other cities?
Staff may have, okay.
Yeah, I can weigh in on that one. So we have, we're not proposing to codify anything. Often when processing an application, there's a number of variables that are at play when we're doing that. But what we have done and have already implemented is when a project is coming to the Architectural Review Board, it is our intent to get that first hearing or that first meeting with the Architectural Review Board within 60 days. And, give or take, a few days in either direction. just based on when these get scheduled. So we are already in the process of getting that initial feedback from the Architecture Review Board early on in the process, even before maybe some issues of zoning compliance may be addressed, so that we can help the applicant streamline their review or facilitate their review.
Oh, wait, interesting. So for like an AHIP or for a streamlined project, the ARB study session would potentially happen even before other like evaluations of like zoning compliance and things like that?
Well, so when we have an application that comes in, there's, depending on the quality of the application, if there's a lot of challenges with it, or there are components of the project that do not clearly comply with the code and will result in significant design changes, we're not going to waste the applicant or the board's time on that. But for projects that generally are compliant with zoning, height, setbacks, parking, all the things that we would look for, we would move that on to the Architecture Review Board for an initial review within 60 days. That's our goal. And that would apply to projects that are, whether they're going through a streamlined review process or whether they're going through a more the previous traditional process of the Architecture Review Board, major ARB subject to the ARB findings. We still do that for those projects as well.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Just want to clarify that and get that all fresh in my head. Thank you. And those were my questions.
Commissioner Heckman?
So I have a few questions, but I think only one is really a technical question, so I'll save the rest and just ask this one. We're seeing in state law, parking requirements are coming down and in some instances actually being eliminated. And I'm hearing anecdotally that the lender community is not entirely buying into this kind of new vision. And so that as your proposed parking drops, the financing tightens up. And that, for example, people who are proposing, who are interested in developing projects with no parking are having trouble finding financing. So I was wondering if in your financial feasibility analysis, you had, you were picking up threads of this and it was considered in the analysis, recognizing, looking at your numbers, that I didn't see anything proposing zero parking, just really more modest decreases, what I could call modest decreases in parking. And so I'm wondering if with those decreases that you're projecting, you're seeing any financing difficulties.
I agree with your assessment that projects that are parked at zero will likely have trouble finding financing for 100% market rate projects. You'll see some of them in really dense areas, but not so much in less dense areas. And so for the prototypes that we analyzed, none of them, as you mentioned, include no parking. A lot of them are parked at one space per unit or half a space per unit. And so we did sort of factor that into the financial feasibility analysis. If we didn't think it would be financed, we would have told Jane and said, this doesn't make sense, so we shouldn't do this. So yes, that sort of was in the background of how we analyzed the prototypes.
Thank you.
Okay, seeing no lights, I have a few questions. Since we're talking about financial feasibility, Mr. Bretz, could you talk to us about what the assumptions were for financial feasibility? I know you talked about the types of assumptions, but I know that in past projects where there was some financial feasibility analysis that was being done, sometimes people disagreed about the assumptions that were going in. So to educate us, it would be really helpful if you could tell us, what is that standard profit margin that is included, as well as maybe interest rates, or what are the kind of key factors that you put into the model?
Yes, sure. I mean, everyone typically disagrees with us on some assumptions, so it's not unheard of. So to start off with, we did a bunch of research on the inputs that we put in the pro forma. So we researched recent land sales transactions. We researched construction costs. We work on projects, throughout the Bay Area, throughout California. We keep track of construction costs. And then we also researched recent sales comparables for similar units and then market rate rents. And so based on that data collection, those are sort of the assumption inputs that we put into the pro forma analysis. So it's based on current, real-time real estate dynamics. And then for the sort of profit margin question, we work on a number of projects. We've talked to developers. We're constantly reviewing real projects and going back and forth with developers. And so on the for sale side, we set the profit margin at 12% of the net sales revenue, which is a common assumption, and which is assumption that is our professional judgment on what the sort of expected profit range should be. For the apartment scenarios, we use the capitalized valuation approach. And so first what we do is we research current capitalization rates. And so there's a bunch of brokerage firms who do surveys every quarter, like CBRE or PricewaterhouseCoopers. And then CoStar also tracks capitalization rates. And then we also get capitalization rates just from the projects that we're working on. And so the first step is what we would do is we capitalize the net operating income, and that comes up with the total value of an apartment project. And then we apply a profit percentage to that capitalized value. And in this case, we set the apartment profit percentage at 10% of that value. And again, that's our professional judgment of where typical apartment profit percentages are set. We've talked to developers, we've reviewed projects, we're comfortable with that assumption. Again, every developer is probably going to say it's too low, but also on the flip side, no developer has ever told us our profit margin is too high. So those are sort of the main factors. And so when all of them are combined, so the construction costs and then are offset by the sales revenue or the capitalized value with that profit margin built in, then we solved for, is there a financial surplus, which makes it seem like it would be likely to be built, or is there a net cost, it seems unlikely that this type of project would be built.
Okay, so one question I have, you were talking about the capitalization, but we've been reading in the news that with the interest rates having gone up, that a lot of projects, say in San Jose and in other cities that were supposedly going to be built, then were put on hold. So how is that factored in?
So the interest rate is going to be separate from the capitalization rate. It was actually kind of interesting. Typically, they'll track with each other, where as interest rates go up, cap rates typically go up. In the past couple of years, with interest rates skyrocketing, cap rates didn't actually go up that much. But the interest rate gets factored into the construction loan in the construction costs. And so as those interest rates go up, the construction interest during the construction period goes up. And yes, it's correct that was a huge hit to some projects that were in the development pipeline. And all of those developers sort of paused and said, let's wait for them to come back down, or let's wait till our numbers shake out. We did this analysis in June. We set the interest rate at 7%. The projects for the proposed HIP standards were deemed financially feasible, so there was at least a slight financial surplus on those ones. But I'll be honest, as interest rates come down, that is going to drop total construction costs commensurately. So in the immediate future, you could have projects perform better with lower interest rates. What could also happen, though, is that could generate demand for more projects. So more materials are being used in the area, more labor is being used in the area, which could increase the direct and indirect costs of the project conversely. So it's sort of yes, in the medium term, interest rates may have an impact, but over the long term, it may not be as drastic as one may think.
Okay, thank you. On a different topic, I have a question about something that was in our packet as well as presented tonight, which is that the HIP is necessary to support the AFFH. And I wondered how it supports that, given that one of the big reasons the HIP is attractive is that it allows in lieu fees, which then means that rather than the affordable units being included in a development, that they would be concentrated in a particular area. Could staff explain that part to me? Is it just that because HIP applies to more areas, then it spreads the housing out more, or?
Yeah, so I'll take a first cut and then ask Jean if she wants to weigh in with some additional context. But in our conversations with HCD, again, HIP isn't required for RENA or meeting our numbers, but it was seen as a tool to increase housing production citywide because we're broadening its extent into multifamily zones. I will note that, and so just by producing more housing, we're putting more on the market, and there'd be a variable, affordability, I'll say small a affordability on that issue. But we will collect, with the collection of in lieu fees, the idea is that we'll be able to, collect more and leverage those dollars further to support additional projects. And so that's the connection that I see between the capital A affordable housing component and HIP, how they come together. Ms. Eisberg, do you have more that you want to add to that?
No, that's great.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, it makes sense in terms of affordability, but the fair housing component, sort of historical redlining and that kind of a thing. And I would think that inclusionary housing is better from that perspective rather than what the HIP allows.
Maybe I can add a couple points then. Part of what the expansion of the HIP is doing is adding the RM sites and faith-based sites on the R1 zones to eligible HIP sites. So these are, whereas the commercial districts are on the corridors, and although the corridors are spread throughout the city, they're not within the neighborhoods. So one of the key parts of the RM zones and those faith-based sites on the R1 zones is that they're more within the neighborhoods of Palo Alto. So a key part of that is really the potential to have multifamily housing across neighborhoods in the city.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you. And then I had a question about retail and the HIP and I can't remember what packet page it was, but it was in the slides talking about reducing the retail requirement except for Calab and University Avenue and certain nodes along El Camino. So which are those nodes currently defined already, or is that a TBD thing that we don't know exactly where those nodes are going to be?
Sure, I can respond to that. So that is a sort of a general reference that is aligned with a document that the city prepared a long time ago, the South El Camino Boulevard or Corridor Plan, or I'm transposing some of the words, I guess, in that study. But in that document, there's a sort of a couple of grainy images of the street grid and identification of nodes in that area that have are identified as areas that we want to continue to promote commercial or mixed use development. So the idea behind the allowing for adjustments to reduced retail for HIP projects would be to allow some reduction in the areas that are not in the ground floor or are combining districts or these key strategic locations along El Camino. And we can come back with a map to show you where those are. They're generally going to be, where California Avenue aligns, and there's a couple other streets that intersect along El Camino that would be flagged. The other part about El Camino that's challenging, as you know, is that some of the streets aren't approaching at clear intersections or offset a little bit. And so that takes that into consideration too.
So how old is that South El Camino Real design guidelines? Or approximately? Because it's not been readjusted given our El Camino Real focus areas, right? Or it's not been adjusted since we identified all the new housing element sites, correct?
We'll find that it's been decades since that's been produced, but we still have that record. And as part of the housing focus area work and then the expansion work that we're about to get underway as well, we'll be looking also at that that guide to inform decisions about development potential in those areas as well.
Okay. Commissioner Suma has a question that's directly related to that.
Yeah, when I read this, I was wondering if it was based on the Grand Boulevard concept that was never adopted.
No, it's the South El Camino design guidelines or something along those lines.
And the string of pearls idea?
Yes.
That's a pretty stale, well, I'll wait till later to make comments, but.
Agreed, but I think what maybe what may persist through time, though, is sort of the desirability of maintaining local serving commercial at strategic locations along El Camino to serve the areas. I agree that other parts of the document may have advanced, but I think it's worth at least exploring as a part of this process whether or not we want to retain maybe a higher standard for retail on the ground floor at those locations.
Okay, thank you for that. I'll save my comments for later.
Okay, I have two more clarifying questions. So one is the AHIP the same piece of legislation that also says that if a development in Palo Alto is 100% affordable, with affordability being defined as 120% of AMI or lower, then the development fees are waived for that project? So we had seen a project that came before the PTC this year that was 100% affordable and then therefore would not pay development fees as a result.
That is not, sorry, that's not part of the AHIP. It's been a longstanding part of our individual development fee ordinances.
Understood. Okay. And then my final question is, there was a comment that was made during the presentation that the AHIP has only been used one time in 6 years. And I was wondering if we knew how many, and it was for Wilton Court, I believe, but how many other affordable projects were there? So I'm kind of wondering, is it that AHIP's not being used or just that affordable projects aren't being built because it's so difficult to achieve like the financing for affordable projects?
Yeah, I agree. I don't know that there's a causal relationship necessarily on that because there are other factors that go into affordable housing production. So you're right. It is the Wilton Court that is the example that set the standard for the AHIP program. And what we're trying to do here then is allow for greater development potential, sort of in line with, I'll say, some recent policy direction that we've been developing as a part of the housing element and with the housing focus area. But then also associating that increased height with that lower affordability. But you're right. I don't know that we can say one's directly related to the other.
Right. Like, I don't know. It's not necessarily that the AHIP doesn't work. I mean, it may not work, but also just there's not been a huge number of affordable housing projects in general, right, that didn't use the AHIP.
Right. And it goes back to the earlier question about the applicability of the AHIP, where, you know, there just are, the state law has advanced to a point where AHIP itself may be less desirable for more deeply affordable housing production. So this does create, though, an opportunity. I know in the past we've had some conversation about middle income housing. We have the one example that people cite as maybe not a great example on Page Mill Road in El Camino, but the AHIP with its affordability up to 120% AMI, which is a more restrictive affordability than that one particular project, which went up to 140 and 150% AMI. Still may provide an opportunity for interested for-profit developers to build in that market, and I think we've seen some interest, in that neighborhood of affordability. So I think it still has the possibility of being another avenue where somebody may want to build an affordable housing project at 120% AMI.
Okay, thank you. And then we've got two more lights going up. Commissioner Aiken, can we go to Commissioner Zuma first? Is that okay? Just because. Oh, okay. So Commissioner Aiken, then go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. This question is for Mr. Brett, and I'd like to follow up on Chair Chang's question about financial feasibility. Pardon me. A reference that I commonly use for financial feasibility studies is Century Urban's that's done for San Jose and updated every year. And the calculation that they use for minimum acceptable developer profit is a 5.75% return on cost. So I was curious if you would, and I did work those numbers for some of the prototypes, and the target profit turned out to be less than KMA's. So I wondered if you would say a few words about why the approach you used is preferable.
Yeah, so we've shifted from doing a return on cost metric, and this happened, a few years ago when capitalization rates really dropped. So what the return on cost metric is, it's a capitalization rate plus a profit margin built into the same percentage. And so it's typically the capitalization rate plus 1 to 2 percentage points on top for profit. And that would get you to your 5.75 or 5.5% return. What ended up happening is with lower capitalization rates, so we're using a 4% capitalization rate in these analyses, a 2% percentage on 4% is a much bigger number than 2% on like a 6 or 7% capitalization rate. And so we're ending up with big profit margins that didn't make sense, and we didn't think were justifiable. So that's why we split the analysis. And so we just take the capitalization rate itself, come up with the value. The cap rates, again, are based on empirical data, real projects. And then we set the profit percentage on, what our professional judgment, the profit percentage would be, and set that against value. And so then the profit is less driven off of how cap rates fluctuate.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, I think that's it for our clarifying question. No, she's done. So do we have any public comments that have come in? There's one here in chambers.
Yes, one in person from Nikita.
Oh, yeah, thank you. My name is Nikita. Hello. I live in Palo Alto for 3 years, and with my family and kids. So we're renting townhouse, pay like $6,000. That's insane. So I was hoping to maybe buy something. I cannot afford a house because they cost starting from $2 million, and I cannot afford affordable because I'm apparently too rich for that. So maybe I'm kind of stuck in the middle. This is why I'm here. I want to support this project. Increasing density is long overdue. And a couple of notes regarding parking. So I personally was happy to buy condo with zero parking, for example. But what I think is missing is requirements for bicycle parking. because like when we increase density, we want to discourage people from using cars, right? And like encourage them to use bicycles. So like bicycle parking would be great if we have this like in requirements. And what another thing, like I'm not sure if in US it's a thing, but like for example in France, they instead of minimum parking requirements, they increase the maximum parking requirements. So like for example, like not like we require not like at least 20 parking lots, but like at most. So like this is like one idea. And yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, one more thing about previously we're talking about reports about collisions. So and you're talking about serious injuries and maybe deaths. I think non-serious injuries should also be included in the report because they can indicate the problematic intersections. So it could be useful. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. And just to clarify for members of the public who may be listening, the current report does include injuries. It just doesn't break them out for us into what is serious and not serious. Okay.
I have one on Zoom also.
Oh, great. Thank you.
From C.
Hello. I missed the first bit of this, so I'd like to apologize if this was already covered. But in the meeting notes, it noted that the plan was to streamline all 100% affordable housing development projects that would prioritize them over other housing projects regardless of submission date. And I just wanted to point out that because Palo Alto has a affordable like inclusion ordinance, a lot of larger projects have to have affordable units in them, whether that be in lieu fees or included. And so to me, it seems a little illogical to prioritize a 20-unit 100% affordable housing project over a 100-unit 25% affordable project, which has more market rate units, but also nets you more affordable units. And I was kind of hoping that maybe the streamlining could be done based on the number of total affordable units rather than just sheerly anything that's 100% affordable, because I think that might benefit more since it seems like there's more market development, like development of market housing than there is 100% affordable anyway. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you for your comment. Okay, then I think that brings us back to commissioner comments and discussion. So yeah, the staff is just looking for us to go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but did, through the chair, want to share the additional information. We found that the South El Camino Real design guidelines are from 2002. Those are available online. The nodes that are listed there are at some of the larger intersections, California Avenue, Baron Ventura, there's the Triangle area, are the nodes that are noted there, with the idea that in between that, it may be more reasonable to have residential only developments.
Thank you. Okay. So I was saying that our goal is to provide feedback to staff on the proposals or the various things that can be added to the HIP. So I'm trying to think, we've got two lights here from Commissioner Heckman and Commissioner Aiken. Remember, there's two areas that we also need to provide comments on, and maybe we don't have comments regarding the AHIP and more on the HIP, but I'm not going to structure the discussion any more than that. Okay, go ahead, Commissioner Heckman.
Thank you. So I have some questions that aren't really clarifying questions that I want to ask in this round, and then I'll provide comments in a subsequent round. And I'm hoping that these questions help to really frame sort of the bigger picture of why we're even talking about this right now. So my first question is, well, the staff report has divided the field of changes into plan changes. So those are those that are arising pretty clearly from one of the two housing elements that we've adopted, 3.3 or 3.4, and then what they describe as potential changes. So those aren't really spelled out in those policies, but these are the building blocks that our consultants have talked about that will, help achieve what should be financially feasible projects that provide housing. So my first question is, if the city adopted all of these potential changes and the potential changes in addition to the plan changes, and as a result, we were, I'm going to say, too successful in the sense that we were overrun with development applications, and realized that in some ways we're perhaps provided too much flexibility or generous relief from the current requirements. These are all ordinance-based, and so we would have the opportunity to relook at this, amend the ordinances, and of course, people who had applications pending, perhaps they would benefit from the prior version, but moving forward, we could basically tighten the flow a little bit. I wanted to make sure that that would be normal process. I want to make sure that there's no reason that that wouldn't be occurring with these ordinance changes we're contemplating.
So yes, based on current state law, I believe that is correct. That if we found that we were, in that scenario that you described, we would have the ability to evaluate that. But let me check in with Albert Yang to see if he has a different perspective on that.
That's exactly right.
Okay, thank you. Second question. If we only make the planned changes and none of the potential changes, what are the prospects of Palo Alto making substantial progress toward our RHNA housing numbers in this sixth cycle based upon these revised city regulations that would include the plan changes and the state law vehicles described in the staff report?
So are you asking if the AHIP, which is more prescriptive, were to go forward, but the HIP, which is less prescriptive, did not go forward?
No. As I'm reading the staff report, there are some plan changes for the AHIP and some plan changes for the HIP.
Yep.
So we go ahead and we make those changes, but none of the potential changes. So we just make the plan changes, but don't do all of the other things that the consultants have talked about. So now we have those two vehicles available for applicants to potentially apply for, or they can use one of the three state law vehicles, the SB 330, the 35, the state density bonus law. So I'm trying to sense if that is the envelope of possibilities, how realistic is it that we're going to see significant development here in this sixth cycle to move us toward our RHNA numbers?
So I can get started, and then Jeannie may have something to add as well. The categories of changes, there are certain things that are pretty explicit in the housing element. And so it's pretty straightforward to go ahead and bring those forward to you for consideration and moving forward with them. There's another category of changes, which we still do need to make some changes. There is that commitment in the housing element, and it is part of, beyond the RHNA, the providing additional housing throughout the city. And those are the ones where it's not as explicit, which is why we had to do this additional study. It's listed as potential, because the exact components that we will move forward with are not yet explicitly defined, but there is still a commitment to make some changes. And then Jeannie, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Nope, that was a great explanation. Thank you.
Well, maybe let me ask it a different way. If we make the minimal changes that we can make to our existing regulations, consistent with these new policies that are in our housing element, what's the likelihood that we're going to make substantial progress over the next 6 years, the rest of this cycle, toward our housing goals? Or are we really binding ourselves to something that's not a lot better than we've seen used, the HIP and AHIP already used for, in the last few years?
I want to distinguish, again, HIP and AHIP from RENA, which is our housing target goals. We have planned for those numbers, and in that regard, if we adopt the HIP or not, we'd still have, that wouldn't affect sort of our RENA numbers, but it does have consequences for housing element implementation, and HCD would likely find us not compliant with the housing element if we did not proceed with HIP standards. So that's one component of that. If we make the minimum changes, and when you say minimum changes, I'm thinking that's the prescriptive language that is in the housing element for AHIP, and it is the package of suggested changes that is before the PTC for discussion tonight, that package of options. If that were to move forward, then, and that might be the crux of the question that we're trying to understand here, then I think we're in compliance, and our housing production, we would expect to be increased, the potential for housing production. I don't think we have a number associated with that, but it would also make up for any deficiencies that there may be in the ordinary course of development, that where our housing opportunity sites aren't developed as planned.
Okay, good.
And just, I think part of what you were talking about may have tied to the final 3 slides that the consultant shared during their presentation, where they had 2 slides, one about AHIP and one about HIP, which were the pretty prescriptive items that were pretty straightforward to move forward with. And then a 3rd slide, the final slide, that had a list of these different modifications to the development standards. And so I would not call those first 2 the minimum. I think based on the study that's been done, we do need to also consider some additional changes of what is listed on that 3rd slide, that proceeding without making some of those modifications, as the director was saying, would likely find us not in compliance with our housing element in terms of implementation. And so then the discussion tonight can be, if there are some of those items in that final package that are of significant concern, we can talk about if there are adjustments that could be made to that while still being compliant with the housing element.
Okay, and I'm supportive of that last page bullet list. What I'm really trying to frame this conversation with is what happens if we are too conservative, if we're right, because I mean, if over the next 6 years we build 1,000 units using the AHIP, even though those are not on opportunity sites, they still reduce our remaining RENA balance, so that's good. So what I was, really trying to figure out is, really trying to set up is, I think we need to use the work that's been done here to set us up to succeed and set us up to come closer to those RENA numbers, even on the non-opportunity sites, because there are consequences when we get to the end of the cycle if we are deficient.
I would argue there are consequences before we get to the end of the cycle if we do not implement the housing incentive program.
Right, and that was the point you were making. Is we're gonna get in hot water with the HCD much earlier than 6 years from now if we don't take enough of these steps
2 years now. I know.
to have what they feel is a state law compliant plan to go forward.
Yes, and I think from their perspective, it's implementing the housing incentive program. And from our perspective, it is trying to find the right balance of development standards that we want to, the levers that we want to adjust to make sure that the development is consistent with sort of our interests, and while still allowing for a feasible development, economically feasible.
All right. Very helpful. Thank you.
Commissioner Aiken.
Thank you, Chair. I'm struggling with whether to get on into the details to start with or to hit the general points first. I think maybe I'll do the details because they'll be easier to work through. The iterative process that the consultants went through, I think, probably gave them a good sense of the interactions between these modifications and how important each one was. But for those of us working from the final product, it is really difficult to understand that because the prototypes don't apply the modifications systematically, so there's no way to work back. A good example of this is take a look at site F, which is the RM40, where the no parking option actually yields fewer units than the limited parking option. So you want to know what else changed there and why wasn't the same pattern followed for the two projects? And that's just exactly the opposite of what you'd expect in a real world project. Choosing prototypes of this kind is a design of experiments problem for those of you who have studied that at some point in school. And there are ways to do this methodically. And so if we have to do this sort of project again, it might be nice to look into that. That way we can get some results that we can more easily work back from. Since each of the modifications we're talking about has a quality of life cost compared to what we have today, one approach that you could have taken would be to say, what's the minimum set of changes, of modifications we need to make a financially feasible project possible on each of these test sites, on every one of these test sites? And that would get you a different set of answers than we're looking at today. And I don't have a good sense for how it would vary. So that leaves me a little bit unsettled. But I decided to do what I could to make a stab at that. So I worked through all of the prototypes and counted the proposed modifications that were actually used. And the big three, no surprise, parking reduction is number one. Reducing setbacks is number two, and increasing the height limit is number three. So it's pretty clear that no matter what we do, those are going to be supported because they need to be. The others, there's a lot more debate about because of the concern about interaction, and particularly how that might have been affected by the choice of the small properties for test sites. I can't draw any more conclusions about that, but I did want to make two closing comments on this subject. One is about maximum residential density. We might have to let that go. I accept that. But if I had a choice, I prefer to keep it because it's one of the few standards we have that actually encourages family-sized units. By not building too many too small, we have the opportunity to encourage projects that have some that are large enough for families. So I'm reluctant to let that one go. And touching finally on the small lot effect, this is outside our purview, but it might be worth staff putting on the list. We might want to think more about incentivizing lot consolidation to get larger lots, in which case all of the modifications that we're talking about would be more effective. Okay, that's all for this round. I'll have more on the next.
Commissioner Rectal? Or Vice Chair Rectal.
That's fine. I'm still a commissioner, yes. Can you pull up the last slide, 29 there? That's just the list of all the different options. And how does this compare to our PHC experience? What did people ask in PHC compared to this list? And I don't know if Jonathan knows that off the top of your head.
So I don't know that we've got a documented comparison of PHC applications to this list, but we do know that those applications routinely ask for increased height, increased FAR, changes to dwelling units, and as Commissioner Aiken noted, those are the ones that always come up. Parking are frequently asked for reductions, and we do typically see setbacks and lot coverage and daylight plane. So I'd say most of these are incorporated into that. These are very similar to looking at this list on slide 29. At least 1 through 6 tend to be, and 7 tend to be pretty consistent with variations of what we would see on a PHC application.
Okay, this is a question for Mr. Bretz. So which of these has the biggest partial derivative? You know, which is the biggest bang for the buck, or are they all interrelated and they all affect feasibility?
They really are all interrelated. I want to point out again, we're working with pretty small sites here. And so what's going to drive value is more units, more income producing units than you can get on the site. So changing parking may allow you to get an additional unit, or changing the height definitely allows you to get more units. And so they all sort of work interchangeably in order to figure out, like, how do you actually get another income or more income producing uses on these sites.
Okay, so when I'm looking at, like, I'm not sure if you have the packet page 66, which has all the proposed zoning prototypes.
Right. Yeah.
And so on each of these, were there multiple parameters that kind of maxed out? You know, so for example, if you look at they list the FAR across the board. If I want to make this more feasible, what am I bumping up against?
Let me get to that. So for each of the prototypes, a number of the development standards were changed. We didn't change just one, like we didn't just change parking in one or density in one. They're all the prototypes were designed with multiple changes made. And so it was, and Jane, I don't know if you want to jump in on sort of how that process played out.
Yeah. So some of the assumptions really have to do with constructability, or the way people typically build the units, and just thinking about all the different design possibilities that make those units more efficient. And so in some cases, just trying to think about how we laid out just some very basic internal circulation, even just to get a sense of, you know, if you're really trying to design this without completely designing it, like what is the most logical thing you could do within the development envelope. And I think when you do that, there's quite a lot of like trying to figure out, okay, whether or not you're being efficient with the structure, with thinking about how the parking works. And so those kinds of things are factored in. They're much more architectural. And wherever it's possible, when you're thinking about the development envelope, the one that really is very limiting is the daylight plane, because it gives you this angle. And that one is the hardest one to work around. And, you know, it makes sense for adjacency for sure. It just has a huge impact. In some cases, it impacts projects from two different sides. And so that's one where it really is very limiting. But the other is just trying to figure out, in some cases, if you could get one more level and then we kind of see where the FAR comes, what it comes to. Or if you're trying to just figure out if you're able to get another unit in a logical manner, there is a little bit of working back and forth. It's seeing what the FAR is now for existing standards, and then also really checking to see if you're able to increase it, then what that becomes. So there's a lot of back and forth. And yeah.
So, for example, if I look at site C, it only has an FAR of 0.94. And that seems kind of low if we're trying to really make this as feasible as possible. So we must have been bumping up against something else on that design. And you think that was circulation or what? I'm not sure if you know these sites off the top of your head.
I do, but sometimes these really specific numbers, I'll try to track it back, but
Okay.
This is, yeah.
If you don't know, that's fine. I was just kind of poking at this.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons you see the variation is that it was different standards for different districts. So sometimes we were not able to fill out the development envelope because we bumped up against the FAR or the density. We typically were able to achieve the height, but not always. So you do see variation across the different districts about trying, what was catching us in terms of not being able to fill out that envelope.
Yeah. And knowing what, on this particular one, what was limiting that might be useful to understand if you're trying to get more production out of the CC2 zone. What other things do you want to consider?
Okay, I finally found it, and if you want to see, I am such a more visual person. Packet page 43 has just sort of the layout, so you can see all that. You see how the site works, and this one happens to be it happens to have retail as part of it. And so retail, it doesn't, I mean, the FAR for retail and the parking associated is perhaps impacting that. And I think that might be it. So the retail makes it a little bit more complicated. So that's my first reaction off of that.
The retail makes it complicated because you're losing space, or there's some design customization that's required when you have retail in the building?
Well, I think the 0.9 FAR had to do with commercial retail with existing commercial requirements, which was quite a large requirement. And it meant that the ramp down, and it also required it required so much parking on site, it required underground parking. And so I think basically the 0.9 FAR really has to do with the impact of the retail requirements there. But when I look at
0.94, is that the amount of residential floor area, or is it the amount of total floor area?
I think it was 0.9 was the commercial FAR, not the overall. So the overall for that was 1.4.
Okay. Another question for Mr. Bretz is, in the indirect costs, when I look at this, it's varying from like 39% up to 48%. Is labor considered indirect cost?
So the indirect costs are their architecture, engineering, and we split it up into various categories. So it's architecture, engineering, and consulting, permits and fees. The affordable housing in lieu fee is included in indirect costs. And we have taxes, insurance, legal and accounting costs, marketing costs, a development management fee, and an indirect cost contingency allowance. So those all combined, plus financing, are included in that line item.
Okay,
and
so labor is under direct cost then?
Yeah, labor, like your typical labor, will be included in the direct, the shell cost of the construction of the building. We have a contractor allowance on this individual pro formas.
Okay, and so is there a quick answer what's the difference between 39 and 48%? Is it just you have some economies of scale in the larger project?
Yeah, there's likely economies of scale. Again, it might be the affordable housing in lieu fee. Let me look and see.
Okay.
What page are you on?
66.
Okay. Yeah, so I think in this one, it looks like it is, it's probably related to the architecture, engineering, and consulting costs. We vary that between the townhome and the apartment projects, and then also how the economy of scales are achieved.
Okay. And one last question. One of the concerns in the housing element was that there's a tendency to go to micro units, and we wanted to make sure that we had various different types of designs. And so there's a program that exempts floor area if you have 3 or more bedrooms. So the extra bedrooms don't add to your floor area ratio. But now if we're doing this and we're relaxing the floor area ratio, does this make that program less effective?
We haven't developed any implementing or proposed any implementing regulations for that program at this moment. So I don't know that we've.
Well, but just that concept, the program is to evaluate whether that could be used to encourage. And Commissioner Aiken brought up the point that if we get away from the maximum density, we may end up with a whole bunch of micro units because that will be more profitable. And so this would be one other way. I said, well, if we're going to get rid of the maximum density, what other knobs do we have to encourage large units? And that this program in the housing element would be one knob that perhaps would encourage larger units. But now if we are relaxing the FAR requirements, now maybe they don't need that extra AR. And so they'll say, I'd rather have two bedrooms as opposed to a 4-bedroom. Does that make sense?
It does. And I don't know, Ms. Eisberg, if you have some response to that. Otherwise, we can take that comment and give some thought to it.
I would say in general, it would be a bit of a gift. So let's say you achieve the 2.5 FAR and then you get an exemption for additional FAR for the 3+ bedroom units. I would say, with the exception of maybe a developer choosing to do a townhome project, and I know the housing element calls for increases in minimum densities to avoid that, developers do frequently want to do more until they hit at the end of a certain construction type. So the models that Jane has showed are really about wood construction over a concrete podium. And at some point after the 5 stories of wood construction, we kind of max out that typology. But hopefully that helps a little bit. It could be a gift, but there's a cap.
Depends. Yeah. In some cases, if you have some extra room, you might use it. Otherwise, in general, you might not. Okay. But just, I do have a concern. If there's any other knobs that we can think of to increase the likelihood of having larger units, I think that'd be a good thing. I don't want to be building micro units only. I want a variety. Okay. Thank you.
Commissioner Suma?
So thank you for this report. I have to say, I was very interested in Commissioner Aiken's his initial comment, which sort of said, yes, at first glance, this report provided a lot of data, but you couldn't quite see how the conclusions were arrived at. And that was something I felt too. At a very high level, and there was a lot of work done here, so I really appreciate it, but at a very high level, the outcome of this will be to concentrate dense housing where we already have dense housing, with the exception of where we're really changing ROLM to housing in certain locations in the city. And the reduction, the way to get there is by reducing development standards for people living in the new housing, but it will also reduce the development standards for people living closest to the new housing or what's being proposed. It will also eliminate retail and parking options. And we've had projects come in where they could have less parking, and they've wanted to do very big condo projects, and they've wanted them to be fully parked. And we've also seen fewer, they haven't come to us yet, but we've seen some preliminary proposals for really underparked by our current standards and very small micro units. So to me, I guess what was missing for me, and I don't mean this to sound flippant at all, but was because the profit is directly tied to reducing the quality of life for our future and current residents. And that's troubling to me, but I guess I was hoping to see an evaluation that also included sort of the lowest profit that would still attract development, because that would be associated with the least diminished development standards for quality of life. And I think it's packet page, I have to find it now, but it's packet page 20 at the top. No, this isn't it. Anyway, it was about this change in setbacks, and it was oh no, it's packet page 22 at the top. Once again, we have transition areas that are greatly reduced, except we're going to retain them where zones abut R1. I really feel that should read low density residential zones. R1 keeps sneaking in as being the only one we were going to protect this way, and I find that troubling. And I think it might just be kind of a little bit of not thinking. So I'd like to see that reflect what minimum protections we might come out with in the end. I would like to see that reflected for change to reflect our concern about all low density residential zones. So, and I am also worried about getting all micro units, but I'm also worried about developers wanting to just have all very big, very expensive condo projects. So, and I think we kind of, so and then when it comes to being consistent with AFFH, I'm not really sure how it's consistent when, as I said, with the exception of new neighborhoods where we didn't have residential uses before, all the density is exactly where it is. And I'm not suggesting we put it in other places in the city, but where it would be unwanted, because that isn't my goal, but I think it's pretty impactful the way it's being suggested, but we may have to do some of these things I don't know, as we contemplate this more. Plus I think also if we're going to raise the height in certain areas between 5, which is insignificant to me, and 23 feet, we have to also add on another 33 feet that state law would add to the 23. No? The director is shaking his head, so.
This is an alternative to the state density bonus, which is why we're proposing those standards.
Yeah, if they were to use it. It's very hard. Somebody mentioned this, I can't remember who, but it's hard to, I was Commissioner Liu. It is hard for me to kind of look at these and think they're going to be more attractive in most cases in the state density bonus law, which has no end of waivers that you can have. So those are my initial comments. Thank you.
Commissioner Liu.
Thank you. I'll just mainly focus my comments on like one discussion topic about streamlining for this round. But firstly, I did want to say that I'm really excited to work on this. I think it addresses some of the wonkiness in the housing element. In the past, I've taken issue with how in the Ventura neighborhood, we have one housing element site that is, I believe, the Chevron, but then 1.5 blocks away, the Shell is not a housing element opportunity site. And I think by really strengthening these measures, we have more consistency and predictability, and an option to develop neighborhoods and corridors more than some of the lot by lot zoning previously offered. On my main discussion topic right now, I'm curious about any other consideration about streamlining, both for the HIP and for the AHIP. And one reference point that I have like very prominently on the top of my head is Executive Directive 1 in Los Angeles, if anyone here is familiar with that. I think that's gotten a lot of positive attention about how by giving a 60-day shot clock for approvals, that there were, I think, in the ballpark of 18,000, 100% affordable at 80% affordability requirements units proposed by privately funded developers. And to me, that seems like an amazing success that like maybe we can't get to such aggressive levels of streamlining, but something that we should look at and something that that could really reduce those indirect and soft costs in our analysis. So I want to get some reactions to that, maybe from Mr. Bretz, like, how much can we move the needle with streamlining for some of these costs? And yeah, like, is that a viable alternative to some of the other physical site changes that we've been discussing?
I don't know if you're going to achieve like specific cost reductions enough to overcome like adding an extra floor or reducing parking standards or that. But I will say that developers really love certainty. And so if they know that they can go through a streamlined process and get, enter the application on day 1 and get out of it on day 100, and they know all the milestones in the meantime, that gives them a lot more certainty. And that sort of, it's like a sort of non-cost, but like it helps them with their development process in general. So I do think that you'll definitely achieve some sort of carrying costs, some architecture and engineering costs, but the idea of certainty would be very beneficial for developers.
Okay,
thank you.
Yeah.
It's going to be hard to quantify exactly like, what does a streamlined process take versus a non-streamlined process take. You could take out, a few months for land carrying costs, but really I think the certainty that developers will gain will be the bigger benefit.
Okay. I'm curious, Ms. Eisberg or Director Late, how we can think about more aggressive streamlining, maybe committing to some of the, like 60-day deadlines for ARB review or some of the other things that we strive for and actually publicizing those. Like, could that be something that we bring back next time we look at the HIP and AHIP?
So, Commissioner Liu, thank you for that. I do think we actually have some significant streamlining initiatives that we have already embedded into it. And I think the distinction maybe between what we've done and what you're asking for is us having some codified mandate to process something within 60 days. And I don't believe that we are, I would want to study more about the, workload implications about that. Should we start seeing a increase in housing applications, which we're expecting? We have committed to, and we have already implemented a number of measures. We have talked about housing projects being exempt from architectural review, subject only to one courtesy review, and we would process that again quickly. For projects that are subject to architectural review, we've committed in the housing element, and we have already implemented reviewing projects within 45 to 60 days. we have a stated goal to process applications within 90 days after a development application has been deemed complete. So these are specific numbers that we've identified to help streamline our efforts. And I believe in that context, it's similar to ED1, where they've identified streamline review initiatives. I don't know if they've codified them or if it was just part of a broader policy, but we too have identified policy objectives in that regard. So yeah, so I guess if there's more specific recommendations on streamlining, we're happy to understand what those are. But I would say with respect to HIP, we're really looking at development standards as a in this context to see how we could respond to the housing element on the HIP piece, which is again development standard focused and not streamlining focused.
Yeah, and I totally understand our existing efforts on streamlining, and I'm not saying that 60 days is a magic number for us for any specific milestone. I think if we do believe that ED1 has been effective, or like the principles of really aggressive streamlining have been effective, I see that as one potential option to explore. That doesn't compromise some of our other, like, physical standards. I'll leave this here though, and would be curious if any other commission members have thoughts about streamlining and whether that's a lever we'd want to explore more before that comes back to us. So thank you.
Seeing no other lights right now, I'd like to comment, and I'll start with where Commissioner Liu ended. So I guess my question is this a problem that even needs solving? In other words, how long do we typically take to respond to, how long does it take to turn something around right now? And I can see if it were, 4 months, then maybe we should say, okay, we want to cut that time in half or something. But if we're already at around that amount of time or even less potentially, then maybe this is not a problem that necessarily needs solving.
I suppose that it depends on who you're asking and their experience, but I will tell you that there's a lot of variability on the applications that we process. And where we get criticized on how long we take is on planned home zoning applications, PC or PHC applications. And you'll notice in the housing element, we make no reference to planned home zoning or PC zoning applications as a tool to advance our housing production objectives, principally because we understand that it is not an efficient tool or process to produce housing. And we've relied on other measures, changing our baseline zoning, the housing incentive program, and many other programs. And in those cases, those are legislative actions which require hearings before the City Council, the Planning and Transportation Commission, Architecture Review Board, back to the Planning and Transportation Commission, and then on to City Council. You're in the process of reviewing one at 660 University. And that's an application that often gets cited as taking too long. But a review of that record shows that the city's time that is not all city time. I'll note that, meaning that the applicant has spent time not submitting revised plans or getting materials back to us. So there's some variability in that. Your question is this a problem to solve? I think when it comes to these objective housing projects and affordable housing projects, it's not a problem from my perspective, and we also need to see more housing applications coming in. So with I think it's something for us to continually to be mindful about how long and to track this as a metric. How long is it taking us to process these applications? Are we meeting our 45 and 60 day goal? And if we're not, then we need to look at some strategies to achieve that. But at this moment, I don't believe it's a problem to solve. And I will note, Coleman Frick has noted that as a part of the HIP, we do actually have some streamlining initiatives. One is that HIP would be subject to one architectural review. So that's instead of the up to three hearings. And we've also removed the director's discretion in being involved in that. And as Tim had noted, developers like predictability. And so when you remove that discretion out of whether you can take advantage of a certain provision, that helps move the project forward as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Director Late. Because we always hear about the Palo Alto process, but my sense is that the Palo Alto process is often it relates to certain projects that are particularly high profile. In other words, if it weren't particularly complex, like a PHC, those things kind of just get approved. And there's a lot that happens, and our staff is working hard on lots of more standard projects that don't take nearly that much time. And that often, I've heard that the answer from staff when asked, well, why did something take so long? It would be because it was an incomplete application, or the project entirely changed because the applicant changed their design. So that's why I asked that question, because it does sound like, without knowing that there's a systematic problem going on, I'm not sure that it makes sense to be focusing our efforts solely on streamlining. And absolutely, if it starts taking too much time, then it would be lovely if we could just throw more city resources at it, right? Like city council could resource more people. And that would be lovely if we could have more housing being built without relaxing other standards, but that doesn't seem to be the issue. And so thank you for saying that. I wanted to comment, first of all, to thank staff for all their work on this. And I can see how thoughtful staff was in coming up with these ideas and taking into account the desire not to impact like neighboring zones too much, at least. And so I had a couple thoughts. If you could pull up the slide that has the 9 discussion topics, that might be helpful. So I think the lowest hanging fruit on this slide is number 8, which talks about allowing the downtown housing plan in San Antonio area plan to dictate a modified HIP for those areas. But one thought I had was that, well, sure, that makes sense. But then another thought I had was that we may move much more quickly on the HIP than on the downtown housing plan as well as the area plan. And so if we come up with things for the HIP, maybe we adopt them for those areas as well until those areas come up with something, they might decide to go further. But that might be a way to help things along and speed things along. I think that the areas, of course, that I was most concerned about as I looked at some of the proposals were setbacks, daylight plane, the parking, and then there's the first slide on HIP, which was about modifying the retail requirements. So starting with the retail requirements, I just really want to make sure that what's included, like, I think it does make sense to modify the retail requirements. I just want to make sure that we really do have robust nodes along El Camino, particularly because we want to put in more housing there, and particularly because we don't want to increase congestion, and we want to have people have services within 15 minutes of their home, or walkable services. And so I'm not sure, having not looked at it, I don't know if those South El Camino Real guidelines are good enough, and that we might need to kind of carve out a few more areas. So that's really important to me. In addition, when we most recently looked at retail in Palo Alto, what we saw was that the retail that was doing the best in the city was those retail areas like on El Camino. Like, we don't have as many vacancies there. That's the lowest vacancy rate. So what I would hate is for us to inadvertently destroy some of the most successful retail in our city that serves some of the areas that are served least. So that's my first thought regarding retail. Regarding parking, I thought that the public comment that was made about ensuring that there is bike parking to replace the the car parking is something that we should include. So in other words, if we do put any parking reductions in there, then we should put some bike parking increases to go along with it. That makes a lot of sense and makes it ensures that there's at least somewhat of a solution. I also was a little bit confused about that discussion that took place around a CC2 parcel that had a retail requirement. And was it the retail parking requirements that were also putting a limitation on that parcel? Yes, Mr. Bretz maybe has an answer on that.
I'm going to jump in and say that FAR on the CC2 proposed project is a typo. It shouldn't be it shouldn't be 0.94. It should be, give me 1 second.
Thank you. Probably is going to make a lot more sense to us.
Yeah, it will make a lot more sense. And good job finding the one typo in the 175-page report.
We are good at that.
I know, that's pretty good. Thank you. It should be 3.81. What I'm thinking. Oh, wait, hold on. Wait. Yeah, 3.81. There's also a lot of scenarios in the background of this model.
Okay. So I think the parking problem may, in some situations, kind of resolve itself because as we've seen, the market rate developments seem to come fully parked. So I'm not going to talk too much about that one. But the reality is that people need their cars here. So if we reduce parking, there will be spillover, and there may be something that we can do to address that. When there's a RPP in the area to say that these folks then are not, like if we're gonna have reduced parking, that's fine. There are people who want to live in places with reduced parking, but then we need to ensure that those residents are the ones who actually live there. So maybe we can exclude those developments from participating in the RPPs or something like that. Regarding the daylight plane, I think that one makes sense potentially, but then it needs to be done in only when the rear setback is not affected. And I understand that this is a package of recommendations, and I believe in the current package, for the most part, the rear setback is not touched. Is that right? I'm trying to look at the chart on packet page 21. No, not packet page 21. There was, packet page 19. So where I get the example on packet page 19 was only for RM30. Where I get really concerned about the setback is we saw that 10 feet wasn't sufficient for Palo Alto Commons and Wilkie. Like that's something that we've just seen. And so again, I think the devil's in the details with this. Like theoretically, maintaining the daylight plane starting at a higher level could be a reasonable thing to do, but I don't fully know where, like where is it that we would have a reduced rear setback? If we don't, then maybe it's not a problem. I don't want to keep going and going, but I have a lot of other comments, so maybe I'll let other people go first, and then we can come back to some of my other comments. Go ahead. We have Commissioner Heckman and then Aiken.
So I've been particularly appreciative of Commissioner Aiken's deep dive into a lot of this material. I think he has brought forth a lot of really interesting points and seen a number of things that I hadn't, and that's been really useful to our discussion. I liked his identifying what he called the big three. In these are the of these building blocks to get a financially feasible project. The things that he saw consistent across the different models that really are going to need some relief, reducing setback, reducing parking, and increasing height. And I agree with those. I also, based on the diagrams here, it seems like the daylight plane increasing the starting height for that measurement from 10 to 16 seems like a really important one. Because it seems like if we don't do that, then we lose a lot of top floors or portions of top floors. The max density, losing the max density, there was, and Vice Chair Rectal also commented on this. There's logic to this concern that if we do that, then we'll just get little boxes. But, when I looked at the analyses, the RM, for example, on packet page 46, the RM20, no maximum density, but we go from 4 to 7 units and we reduce the unit size from 2,500 to 2,341. And similarly in the RM30 on the next packet page, we're going from 4 units to 7, no maximum density, but we're going from 1,650 to 1,457. So it seems like those are unit sizes that logically accommodate 3 bedrooms or more in the RM20. And so I sort of wanted to test the hypothesis that no maximum density will yield micro by asking our consultants about their observations in the marketplace. Are there places that have no maximum density? And are they seeing routinely developers going as small as they can to get the biggest unit count they can, or are they seeing something different?
I think, Jeannie, if you know more, but okay, so I'm just thinking about your question some more. So you're just wondering if it's typical that we're starting to see micro units. I always feel like, or smaller units versus larger units, I feel like developers really are approaching it from like who they're trying to serve and who their clients are. So I'm not, well, I don't know. We're all kind of wondering if developers will just maximize. But I think that given a market, my experience has been it's based on some understanding of who they're trying to target as far as who they sell it to. So I guess theoretically you can imagine that first of all, we wanted to provide average unit sizes that had some flexibility. Often when we looked at how these units fit within the development envelope, we tried not to make them too small. The idea is that there's enough flexibility for variety. And so in some cases, especially where the lots are really small, we knew that this is, in our own mind, competing with other buildings nearby that are about that size too. So just, there's a way of approaching it that really is about if we can maximize based on conservative numbers. So I don't know, Jeannie, if you have other things to add.
I'd like to weigh in actually and note that you're highlighting an important distinction, I think, in the prototype of construction, or the construction type that would be used in the RM zones in particular, where our analysis found that apartment units are less likely to be constructed in those zones from a developer's perspective because they can get a better return on the for sale units. And so that's the prototype that makes economic sense. And so you would want to have a larger for sale unit than you might a rental unit, which can then be used for, which could have smaller floor area associated with it. So your point, I think, is well taken in the RM zones in particular, and to the extent that in the commercial zones we start seeing more apartment units. I think it's worth exploring this concept of again, the housing type as being the metric at which you might see a developer seeking to increase density versus square footage and number of units based on that.
So thank you. Ms. Eisberg, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Only that, as Jane expressed, it is a lot of developer choice about the market they're trying to reach. we do see these micro unit projects in certainly in the city of Berkeley, next to the university, in San Francisco, maybe San Jose. It's not impossible, but a lot of the rental housing we see tends to be a mix of units, not so many 3 bedrooms, and I'm hearing that's certainly an interest, but it's typically there's a mix of studios and 1s and 2s. And so on average, I think that's what we could expect.
Okay, so that's helpful. And maybe as this goes forward, these concepts don't, a lot of these different zoning categories will have a unique, they'll be different from each other. The FAR, right? We're going to change the FAR in a number of these, but it won't be uniform. They're not all going to be the same because then they wouldn't be different zoning districts. So maybe when we're looking at whether or not there's no max density, we need to think about whether that's appropriate for each of the zoning districts. And it might be that one or more of them, we don't want that, or like maybe we don't even need that in the RM20 and RM30 because nobody's going to try to build tiny little for sale houses in those districts. So I think that's just something to think about as you move forward. Let's see. In terms of the concept of developer profit, it's always interesting to me when that comes up in these planning commission discussions. And to me, the lowest profit that would attract development is the profit I can make across the street. So if I have $20 million and I want to build a housing project and I can make 12% in Mountain View or 10% in Palo Alto, I'm going to Mountain View because that's where I'll make more money. I think it's the developer profit concept is necessary in the financial feasibility. You have to plug something in there, but ultimately that's not one of our regs, right? It's not that you have your setbacks are this, your floor area ratio is this, and your profit is this. We are going to create an envelope, and if it's attractive to developers, they'll come and fill it with housing. So I try not to get too hung up on that, recognizing that this is the business, that they are profit driven, and if we don't allow them the profit that they want and somebody else will, then we just won't get the housing. So then I'm going to just kind of conclude with kind of a big picture. Our goal here in what we're talking about tonight is to try to incentivize developers to use the HIP and AHIP instead of the state law tools that they have available. And so we can either do that by truly incentivizing them, or we can kind of pay lip service to the concept and not provide enough incentive to them to use HIP and AHIP, in which case they'll just use the state vehicles that really aggravate us because we get no or next to no say. And so I'm supportive of taking steps to maintain modest local control by robust incentives that would actually get developers to do things according to our programs rather than a state law. So, and then when I look at those 9 bullets, I guess I don't feel competent to say we should do less of this and more of that because I don't understand, and I don't think I can be made to understand how these all interrelate, and if we reduce one, how much we have to increase another one, and which ones to increase. And I'm sure there are many ways to do these models, but I really can't offer any, other than my general support for a package that gets us where we want to go. I can't really micro comment on the individual points, but I do appreciate the micro work that this group has done, the consultants and our staff, to make this really pretty comprehensible for us in all of its detail. So thank you.
Commissioner Aiken.
Thank you, Chair. Right, I want to pop up to a few more general concerns now. One of the reasons that we're pursuing this is we would hope to convince developers to build stacked flats instead of townhouses. And I decided to ask, do the prototypes give us any clue as to whether we would be successful at that? And that's a concern because, of course, we're all unhappy with what happened at the Fry's site, and that seems to be something similar seems to be happening again at new projects now. So in the prototypes, the closest match I could find is Site D, that's the RM20, and Site F with the 10,000 square foot lot, that's RM40. So the townhomes on Site D are more profitable than the apartments on Site F, even though Site D includes affordable units, and Site F went with the in lieu fees, which cost a lot less to the developer. So I think what this is telling us is if you had a developer who wanted to go for an RM40 10,000 square foot lot, they would build townhomes. So the incentives that we're providing here are still not enough to solve that problem. And I'm not clear that we can solve that problem with zoning. But at any rate,
66.
based on what I'm seeing here, I think we still have an issue that we might not have hit that target.
So can I comment maybe on that? Just
please.
Yeah. So and I would ask Gene Eisberg to join in on that. But I think you're right. I mean that's kind of how we see the housing incentive program playing out. That in the multifamily zones and the residential districts that are near also nearest some of our R1 zoning or low density zoning. The standards tend to support more townhome style development. And that's somewhat intentional here because to get to apartment sized units on these lots would require greater development concessions in order to make that financially feasible. And operationally, it's my understanding that individuals developing lots with few units, it's harder to manage smaller number of apartment units than a larger apartment building. That there's some element of scale there as to why somebody would go down that path. So that is feedback that would be helpful to learn from the PTC if there is an interest in creating an opportunity in the RM zones in particular for stacked flats. I'm not sure this plan of this package lends itself to that, but if that is the interest, that's feedback that would be helpful to us. Ms. Eisberg, anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think some of this relates to the size of the sites. So on those smaller sites, it is difficult to switch to the stacked flats, and it's especially about fitting the parking. So when we were looking at that example of the ramp to get to underground parking, you use so much space in terms of drive aisles for parking. And so those small sites, getting them to park is very, very difficult. And that's why we did some sensitivity testing in those RM40 examples of a limited parking scenario or the no parking scenario, because suddenly you eliminate that driveway and that drive aisle. I think there could be a place for moving from townhomes to stacked flats on some of the larger RM sites, but on the smaller ones, it is challenging.
All right, now you've tweaked my curiosity. So why did we see the unit yield on the RM40 5,000 square foot site being higher for the limited parking case than for the no parking case?
I'll have to look at it, but we did look at a 5,000 square foot lot and a 10,000 square foot lot. So I want to make sure we're not comparing the two.
It's the two 5,000 foot options.
Yeah, I see it now. And okay, so what is shown for the 10,000 square foot lot, both of them show a podium. And for the 5,000 square foot lot, it shows four stories above that. It's like ideal for wood construction. And actually what we tested, and now I'm having a hard time remembering why, but it only has 3 stories above the podium for the 10,000 square foot lot. I have a feeling when we were looking at this, we may have been considering something else about that. Oh, you know what it was? It's because on the ground floor, there's only so much space. And in order to meet the parking ratio, we actually use mechanical lifts to stack it. And that is just the maximum you could get for the units for that. So it really is, while it seems like there's the parking, there is more parking. They're just in different configurations. So I hope that makes sense.
Oh, it's not the parking quantity that's the odd thing. It's the residential unit quantity that's the odd thing. You have both more parking and more residential units. So why doesn't the other option have less parking and more residential units?
Can you clarify which packet page you're looking at?
Sure, I believe it's 66. I'd have to check.
66. 66 on the pro forma. You're looking at the pro forma model.
Okay.
So I'm looking at packet page 66, side F on the right-hand side.
Okay.
No parking, 5,000 square feet, 8 units. Limited parking, 5,000 square feet, 12 units, and they're bigger.
And just to confirm, does this also correspond to packet page 50 and 49 in terms of the actual designs? Because the numbers there actually appear to be different.
I think that's well, okay. Sorry, just gonna have to look a little bit longer.
Okay, I believe that there is a design for side F, 5,000 square feet, no parking, that yields 8 units. But this is the point that I was making earlier, was that the combination of modifications that you apply is not systematic enough to derive the rationale for these numbers. So I don't want to go back to that. I've already made that point. But the last point I wanted to make in this round is about what we're getting for this. And I guess this ties into what I didn't understand previously about townhomes being okay in RM zones. So I checked apartments.com for current Palo Alto lease rates and unit sizes. So I'm only looking at rentals here, not looking at for sale units. So all of the prototypes, all of them, are getting us units that are more expensive than current Palo Alto averages. And the sizes of the units are not all documented as far as I could tell in our packet, but for the ones that are, they're also smaller than the average. So what we're getting out of this is smaller, more expensive units than the average that already exists in Palo Alto. Furthermore, thanks to the really excellent KMA report, you can look at comparables nearby. And same is true in Mountain View, for example. So it's consistent. The numbers are believable. But to get this sort of disappointing result, we also have to give up some quality of life. That the people in these new units have less daylight, they have less easily accessible green space, maybe less green space altogether, but certainly not on the ground floor. And if front setbacks go to 0, then we have less public space on the street side too. Parking, who knows? My guess is that we will have some number of people who want to park in nearby streets and neighborhoods, and so we'll have intrusion that we'll have to deal with. And that means an enforcement problem long term. So yeah, we can use residential preferential parking programs, and we should. It's a shame that SBA 34 died this year because it would have prevented AB 2097 areas from using RPPs. But as I've said previously, we should still do that sort of thing locally to make sure that we're achieving the sustainability goal we're setting with reduced parking. And that is to make absolutely sure people are not using cars. Yeah, I guess that's the end of the cautionary tale there, that we just need to be aware of what we're getting as we relax the standards. Thank you.
Okay, since there's no other lights right now, I will go. So I had some questions about the heights. So when I look at packet page, I think it's 19. Nope, not 19, 21. There's a table there. So most of I could sort of understand the rationale for the height changes in most cases, but I was a little bit confused why we wouldn't have a height increase for ROLM, because it seems like it would be just strange to have some places have a 35-foot height, and then right next to it, potentially like a 60-foot, well, maybe not right next to it because there's a focus area, but then right next to it, the 35. So just because it's an opportunity site. So that seemed a little bit strange to me. It seems like an opportunity potentially. And then I was a little bit more concerned about increasing the height for RM20. And again, the reason why I'm interested, I'm concerned for RM20 is because of the potentially low density housing right next to it. So I think we just need to think about that particular, like having seen the impact of the potential impact of the Palo Alto Commons project on the Wilkie Way neighbors, that's like a very concrete example of where setbacks, height, and daylight plane have a pretty negative impact on those houses. I think that for many areas, it's probably absolutely fine. I'm just trying to avoid that scenario. So that's my feedback. Similarly, with respect to the front side setbacks, I think that it's hard to tell like what the front side setback is right now. And when we propose reducing it, how much we would be reducing it. So I think I just don't really understand the implications necessarily. And in particular, my concern for the setbacks is really from a planning perspective. So I would hope that any of the special setbacks that we have throughout the city would not be changed because of this. Those special setbacks are there for planning reasons, because we might need a bike lane, or we might want to widen the sidewalk. So for example, I think about University and how it looks right now and how it could be pretty amazing if we fix things up. I was just in downtown Burlingame, and I mean, it's downtown Burlingame's amazing. They have very few retail vacancies. It's all vibrant, but they have this really wide walkway. And so what I would hate is for any of our HIP plans to prevent something like that from happening on a major thoroughfare. On kind of average streets, maybe it's no problem, but where we have special setbacks, or maybe in certain sections of El Camino on a node, or maybe I don't know where all these are, but we don't want to just have a concrete jungle, and I don't want to inadvertently remove the potential for walkability. So I think that's about it for my comments. Are there other commissioners who have thoughts? Other than that, I mean, I really thought that Commissioner Heckman's point about we need to make this attractive enough so that the development goes where we want it to go, and it's not, if we can, nudge people towards the things that we want as opposed to using density bonus, that's a good thing. So, Commissioner Suma?
Yeah, I don't want to repeat everything that my colleagues have just said, but I would associate my concerns with the things that the chair just mentioned and Commissioner Aiken, and a particular concern to me is the nodes along El Camino. Commissioner Chair Chang already mentioned that that was our lowest vacancy rate along retail in the city. So, but what we do have anecdotally, I have observed vacant on El Camino south of Page Mill is office. And that sort of sprung up there or was grandfathered in there where it was supposed to be retail. So that may be, we may want to look at that existing natural pattern of where we have vacancy now in office there and see if that corresponds to where the nodes were placed. I worry about that. So, and I really worry about the setbacks and daylight plane being adequate only on that first block where we have zones abutting. So interior to the zone, I don't think it's necessarily as dramatic a problem, but I think it really will be for people right on where the zones abut. And I sort of agree with that the market will want to provide both larger units that are very expensive and small units that are very expensive per square foot. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Commissioner Liu?
Yeah, I want to generally echo Commissioner Heckman's comments that I personally don't feel qualified to pick between the specific options presented in that final slide, but that I do care about getting something that's workable. I'll also note that I understand arguments about quality of life, but I think in most cases, these units would kind of be an evolution on what is already here and not necessarily so different from the kinds of projects that have been previously approved in like PCE, PHC, or are just otherwise planned within the city. And while new construction is expensive, we do get affordable housing or in lieu fees out of this as well. I guess I wanted to step back a little bit also. For the purposes of this study session, do we need clearer steers in terms of which of the potential options we should specifically avoid or would prefer? Or I just want to make sure, like, if you're getting enough feedback in what direction we should take this conversation.
From
Go ahead.
Okay, from my perspective, we're going to take all of this feedback, including and especially your comments about the specific types of development standards, for example, shared lot lines, interior setbacks, daylight planes, those adjacencies as important factors. And so we're going to craft an ordinance and a set of standards that I hope aligns with what you've expressed here. I don't need, specific numbers if that's what you're getting after. It's more the spirit of the types of standards that we're going to toggle.
Yeah, definitely not specific numbers, but yeah, I just was not so clear myself, like the spirit of all the things that we care about was really cleanly summarized. So I just want to see what else you needed.
I think that what I would add to that is that anytime we do have consensus on a point, having that clear direction is extremely helpful. But we recognize that because this is so complex and it's got so many factors, that it may be that what we get out of today's meeting really is the identification of the things that you have commented on that are of concern and kind of the general direction that the commission is going. So, you know, we've had a good discussion tonight. We can try and, based on this discussion, pull out some of the things that seem to be of particular interest or concern, as has been described. And if that gets us to a place where we can put together an ordinance for you, then we will do that. If it means that we need to come back for further discussion, then that may delay moving forward with an ordinance on this. That may just need to be the process.
Commissioner Rectal?
Yeah, what's tricky here is that we have to make this attractive to the builders, but we also have to make it attractive to us. And if we go too far either way, it's not going to be useful. So when I look through this, there's some things that I'm not in love with, but I'm afraid that if we change too much, it won't be attractive to the builders. But let me walk through the things.
Staff, could you pull up the slide of discussion points?
Slide 29. And yet, you know, last meeting, we looked at that townhome project that had no trees on it, and that's not good. And my daughter lives up in San Francisco in a very dense unit. They have a small backyard, and that backyard makes the quality of life of that unit so much better. So I would much rather give up height and have a little more setback. And then we have some trees that helps the canopy, helps the environment. There's a lot of advantage to that. And having an extra floor, which means if you can trade an extra floor for backyard, that is a really good trade in my mind. And so I think that trade-off wouldn't necessarily make it less attractive for the builder, provided that they still can do the wood frame construction. You know, at some point, adding floors becomes very expensive. Reduced parking. Reducing parking, if we build too much parking, it's a waste. I'd much rather have an extra bedroom than unused parking. So reducing parking, as Commissioner Aiken mentioned, makes it much more attractive, but there are impacts. And so making it, just because a small decrease in parking is good doesn't mean a bigger one is better. There's some point where you hit the optimal and you actually start making things worse. And we have to be careful of that. The Fear and Peers study tried to look at that. And when I look at that data, it seems to say that we're a little heavy, but not that much heavy. Where there certainly was data in there that shows that we're in the ballpark of what it should be. So I'd be very cautious about doing some wholesale decrease in parking unless we can have either new data to back that up, or if you have some TMA or some other way that you can really attract people who don't have cars. That's the big win. If you can attract the people who don't need the parking, then don't build the parking. And then finally, lot consolidation. Commissioner Aiken mentioned this. We know the bigger the lot, or the bigger the parcel, the more efficient it is to make flats, and to build housing is going to be much more efficient. And is there anything we can do to encourage lot consolidation? Because I think that really solves a lot of problems, or makes our problems less daunting, maybe. So, okay, that's it. Thank you.
All right, I'm not seeing any lights, so I think that we may have exhausted our comments. So no vote needed, right? Because we've just, perfect. So let's move on to the next agenda item, which is approval of minutes. We need to approve minutes on May 29th, June 26th, and April 24th. So I'm wondering if we can do all these at once.
Were we all present for all of them?
I think so, but I'm gonna double check that really quickly. I don't see anything glaring.
Oh, any commissioners present here know they were absent on any of those 3 days? No. Okay, then if I may make a motion to approve the summary minutes of May 29th, the verbatim and summary minutes of June 26th as revised, and the summary minutes of April 24th as revised.
Second.
Great. Let's take a voice vote on this. So all in favor?
Aye.
Oh, I'm sorry, we need to do a roll call vote because
Okay.
Commissioner Liu is remote.
Oh, right. Darn it, Commissioner Lute, just kidding. Okay, Ms. Dow, could you please do the roll call vote?
Yes. Commissioner Aiken,
Yes.
Chair Chang,
Yes.
Commissioner Heckman,
Yes.
Commissioner Liu,
Yes.
Vice Chair Rectal,
Yes.
Commissioner Suma.
Yes.
Motion carries 6-0.
Wonderful. Okay, now we're on to commissioner questions, comments, announcements, or future meetings and agendas. Anybody?
One comment, was it last night? The transportation open house was very nice. They put together, it was like you could just stroll around and ask people about different transportation projects. So I thought they did a really good job. Kudos to them.
Great.
I'm not eligible really to speak during this point, but I
Yeah.
wanted to at least remind you that there's the board commission's recognition event tomorrow, and want to encourage you all to be there if possible, and we'll see you there if you are.
Thank you. Okay, with that, this meeting is adjourned.